Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've been hesitant to share this for years because I know how it sounds. I'm not the type who believes in monsters or goes looking for trouble in the woods. I'm just a regular guy who loves bow hunting and has been doing it for almost 20 years now. But what happened that night in the Sierra County backcountry near Liberty Hill has stuck with me, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was the first weekend of bow season, early September, about 4 years ago. Me and 11 other guys had set up our annual hunting camp in this little meadow we'd been using for years. It's this perfect spot surrounded by tall pines and thick brush, isolated enough that we never run into other hunters. We had our trucks arranged in a rough circle around the fire pit, with our tents scattered around. Some of the guys prefer sleeping in the beds of their trucks, especially my buddy Mark, who swears it keeps him safer from bears. Though we always gave him shit about it, that particular day had been good. Not great, but good. 3 of us had each bagged a buck, including me, a decent 4-point that I'd tracked for nearly 2 miles before getting a clean shot. We were all pretty beat by the time we got back to camp. The evening went like it always did. We cleaned our kills, prepped the meat, drank some beers, ate a feast of burgers and beans, and sat around the fire telling the same hunting stories we tell every year, just with slightly different details each time. By midnight, most of the guys had turned in. I remember checking my watch as I zipped up my tent. It was 12:23. I was sharing with my brother-in-law, Pete, who was already snoring when I crawled into my sleeping bag. The temperature had dropped into the low 40s, and I could see my breath inside the tent. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day's hunt. What happened next is something I'll never forget as long as I live. I was jolted awake by what sounded like an explosion of brush and branches at the edge of our camp. My first thought was that a tree had fallen, but then I realized the sound was moving. Fast. The digital clock on my watch showed 2:11 in the morning. The noise was like nothing I'd ever heard before, like something massive was plowing through the underbrush at the edge of the meadow, snapping branches and crushing everything in its path. Not crashing through like a spooked deer that's all frantic movement. This was powerful, deliberate, heavy. You could feel the weight behind whatever was moving through that brush. Before I could even sit up properly, the most horrifying sound cut through the night. It started as this high-pitched scream that made every hair on my body stand straight up. Pete later said it sounded like a woman being murdered, but that doesn't quite capture it. It was higher than a human could make, longer than any breath a person could hold, and it had this ragged quality at the end, like it was tearing its way out of whatever made it. The scream bounced off the trees around us, making it impossible to tell exactly where it was coming from. I scrambled for the flashlight I keep next to my sleeping bag, hands shaking so bad I could barely grip it. Pete was bolt upright beside me, and I could hear confused shouts from the other tents. Someone yelled, "What the fuck was that?" And another voice, I think was Dave's, shouted, "Bear! It's a fucking bear!" But it wasn't a bear. I've encountered black bears and even the occasional brown bear in 20 years of hunting these mountains. Bears don't move like that, and they sure as hell don't make sounds like that. The thing, whatever it was, thundered past Mark's truck. I could hear the entire bed of his pickup rattle and shake, like someone had given it a good kick, as he described it later. An ice chest that had been sitting in the truck bed toppled over, and I could hear aluminum cans rolling across the dirt. Mark started yelling, and a second later, his truck door slammed. I assume he'd moved from the bed to the cab for safety. By now, I had my boots on and was fumbling with the tent zipper. Pete grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises. "Don't go out there," he hissed, eyes wide in the dim light. But the hunter in me needed to know what was happening. I unzipped the tent enough to stick my head out and aimed my flashlight toward the commotion. All I caught was a glimpse of something large moving through the far side of camp. Not clearly enough to identify it, just a dark mass disappearing into the brush on the opposite side of the meadow. It was big, taller than a person, and it wasn't moving like any four-legged animal I've ever seen. The whole thing, from the first crash through the brush to whatever it was disappearing into the trees on the other side, lasted maybe 30 seconds that felt like a lifetime. After it was gone, the silence was almost worse than the noise. For a few seconds, nobody moved or spoke, then everyone started talking at once. Guys emerged from their tents with flashlights and, in some cases, their hunting rifles. I grabbed my bow, not that I had any intention of using it, but holding it made me feel less vulnerable. Did you see that? What the hell was it? Sounded like a mountain lion. No way that was a cougar, man. We gathered around the fire pit, 12 grown men standing in our underwear and boots, weapons at the ready, looking like complete idiots. Nobody wanted to walk to the edge of camp to investigate. Eventually, 5 of us, including me, grabbed better flashlights and cautiously made our way to where we thought the thing had entered our camp. The brush was definitely disturbed, broken branches and flattened undergrowth, but in the darkness, with just our flashlights, we couldn't make out much. No one was brave enough to follow the trail of destruction into the woods. We agreed to check again at first light and retreated to the center of camp. None of us slept after that. We rebuilt the fire and sat around it speaking in low voices, each of us trying to explain what we'd heard in terms that made sense. A bear, a mountain lion, maybe a herd of deer spooked by a predator, but none of those explanations fit what we'd experienced. As the first hint of dawn appeared, we went back to inspect the area in proper light. The path of whatever had come through was clear enough, a swath of broken branches about 6 feet wide in places, but the ground was covered in pine needles and hard-packed dirt, not ideal for leaving tracks. We found a few scuffs and depressions that might have been footprints, but nothing clear enough to identify. No fur caught on branches, no scat, nothing that would tell us definitively what had visited our camp. Over breakfast, we tried to laugh it off. Someone joked about Bigfoot, and we all chuckled nervously. Dave suggested it might have been a moose, though we all knew moose aren't common in this part of California. Mark, who'd been closest to whatever it was when it passed his truck, just kept shaking his head. "That wasn't a bear," he said quietly, "and it wasn't a cat. It was something else." We finished our hunt that weekend, though nobody wandered as far from camp as they normally would have. When we packed up to leave, there was an unspoken relief among all of us. I've been back to that same hunting ground every season since. The meadow is still perfect, the hunting is still good, and I've never again heard that distinctive scream or had anything crash through our camp with such force. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was just some weird combination of natural events, maybe a bear chasing an elk, both of them panicked and making strange noises, but deep down, I know better. Those heavy footsteps weren't from any animal I'm familiar with. That scream wasn't something that should exist in our mountains. I've replayed that night in my head 1,000 times, trying to make sense of it. The only conclusion I keep coming back to is one I'm not entirely comfortable with. There's something else out there in those woods. Something that doesn't fit neatly into the categories of animals we know. Something that, for whatever reason, decided to tear through our camp that night and let us know it was there. I still hunt those mountains every season. I'm heading back up there in a few weeks, actually. But now I sleep with my bow closer to my sleeping bag, and I always make sure our camp has plenty of lights. And sometimes, when I'm alone on a ridge and the wind dies down, I find myself holding my breath, listening for that scream again. So far, I haven't heard it. And honestly, I hope I never do. Story 2. I still can't explain what happened that night back in the summer of 2016. My husband Thomas and I have talked about it countless times, and we always end up with more questions than answers. I've never shared this publicly before, but after reading similar experiences here, I feel like maybe someone might understand or have some insight. We own a small camp on Cranberry Lake in the northern Adirondacks. It's nothing fancy, just a simple 2-bedroom place on about 3 acres, mostly wooded. That summer, we were staying there while renovating our main house near Lake George. The renovation was taking longer than expected, doesn't it always? So we'd been at the camp for about 3 weeks. On this particular day in July, we'd driven down to check on the renovation progress and pick up some things we needed. Clothes, Thomas's medication, and a few kitchen items I couldn't live without. We got back to the camp around 9 in the evening. It was still light out, but the sun was getting low. As we were unloading the car, I realized I hadn't seen our cat Tiger since we'd gotten back. He was an indoor cat, but occasionally slipped out when we weren't paying attention. He'd done this before at the camp, usually just to eat grass or lounge on the porch, but I always worried because of the wildlife in the area. "Thomas, have you seen Tiger?" I asked as we carried the last bags inside. He shook his head. "Not since this morning. Did you check under the bed?" I checked all his usual hiding spots, under the bed, in the closet, behind the couch, but he wasn't there. Then I noticed the kitchen window was cracked open. I must have left it that way before we left to air out the place. "I think he got out," I said, feeling that familiar worry creep in. The kitchen window was open. Thomas sighed but nodded. "Let's go look for him. He probably hasn't gone far." We grabbed our phones for flashlights and headed outside. It was around 9:30 by then, and the daylight was fading fast. Thomas took the front yard and driveway, and I went around back where the trees grew thicker. Tiger loved to hunt mice in the tall grass back there. I walked along the edge where our cleared yard met the woods, calling for Tiger and making those weird kissing sounds pet owners make. The mosquitoes were brutal, and I swatted at them constantly as I searched. The woods behind our camp are dense, mostly pine and hemlock, with underbrush so thick in places you can't walk through it. It was getting darker by the minute, and the shadows under the trees were already black. That's when I heard it, a loud hooting sound like an owl, but different somehow. It came from the trees maybe 20 yards behind me. I stopped and looked up, thinking I might spot the owl, when another similar hoot came from my left side, deeper in the woods. Something about those sounds made the hair on my arms stand up. I've heard plenty of owls in my life. We live in the woods after all. But these calls were off somehow. Too loud, too purposeful. I turned and started walking quickly back toward the front of the house, calling for Thomas. When I rounded the corner, I saw him standing in the driveway, looking toward the woods with a strange expression. "Thomas, did you hear that?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, weird owl calls." "They don't sound right," I said, and there were 2 of them calling from different directions. As soon as the words left my mouth, the woods erupted with sound. Hoots, chirps, yelps, and what sounded horribly like laughter came from all around us. It wasn't just 1 or 2 sources anymore. It seemed like the entire forest was alive with these sounds. They overlapped and echoed, growing so loud we both covered our ears. Thomas grabbed my arm and we backed toward the house. The noise was disorienting, almost painful. I felt dizzy from it, like the sounds were physically pressing in on us. It wasn't natural. Nothing about it felt natural. The worst part was the laughter. It wasn't human laughter, but it wasn't animal either. It was something in between, something that understood what laughter meant, but couldn't quite get it right. Then, as suddenly as it started, everything went silent. The normal night sounds, crickets, frogs from the nearby creek, even the rustling of leaves in the breeze, all stopped. The silence was almost worse than the noise had been. We stood frozen for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then we heard it. A single twig snapped behind the old tool shed at the edge of our property. The sound was deliberate, almost like a warning. "Get in the car," Thomas whispered. "Now." We didn't run. Something told me running would be bad, but we moved quickly to our SUV. I could feel eyes on us, watching from the darkness. Thomas fumbled with the keys, but managed to unlock the doors. We got in, and he started the engine. As we backed down the driveway, the headlights swept across the tree line. That's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the woods, where the clearing met the trees, was a massive dark figure. It was so still it might have been a tree trunk, except I knew every inch of our property, and there wasn't a tree there. It was tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more. The headlights only caught it for a second before Thomas turned the car, but in that moment, I saw its eyes. They glowed a soft red-orange like coals in a dying fire, not reflecting our headlights like a deer's would. These were generating their own light. I gasped and grabbed Thomas's arm. "Did you see that?" He just nodded, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as he accelerated down our long driveway toward the main road. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. "I don't know," he said, "but it wasn't human." We drove to the nearest town and got a motel room. Neither of us even suggested going back that night. We barely slept, jumping at every sound outside our room. In the morning light, everything seemed less terrifying, but we still dreaded going back. We returned around noon, figuring whatever had been there would be gone in daylight. The camp looked normal, nothing disturbed, nothing out of place. We searched for Tiger again, but couldn't find him. I was sick with worry about him. Thomas insisted on walking the property line. I stayed inside, watching from the windows. He found nothing unusual except for some broken branches high up, about 7 or 8 feet off the ground, along the tree line where I'd seen the figure. "Too high for a deer or bear to break," he said. We stayed at a friend's place that night, unable to shake the feeling of being watched at our camp. Tiger showed up 2 days later, meowing at the door like nothing had happened. He seemed completely fine, if a bit hungry. I checked him over carefully, but he didn't have a mark on him. In the weeks that followed, we had to keep going back to the camp. We couldn't afford to stay elsewhere long term while still paying for the renovation. Thomas seemed to feel it more than I did, that sense of being watched whenever he was outside. He started hearing single hoots from the trees sometimes, usually when he was alone. Twice, he saw the same shape when the motion-activated porch light came on, standing just at the edge of where the light reached. I never saw it again after that night, but I felt it. Something intelligent and not human was watching us, studying us. Thomas became convinced that we'd encountered multiple Sasquatch that night. He thinks they were imitating sounds to confuse and frighten us away from their territory. I don't know what to believe. I've lived in the Adirondacks most of my life and never believed the Bigfoot stories. But what else could explain what we experienced? The coordinated sounds, the massive figure, those glowing eyes, and the feeling of intelligence behind it all. We sold the camp last year. I couldn't take it anymore, jumping at every sound, afraid to go outside after dark. The feeling of being watched never went away. Thomas was reluctant to sell at first, fascinated despite his fear. He'd started researching Sasquatch encounters in the Adirondacks and found dozens of similar stories. The wood knocks, the mimicked sounds, the coordinated scaring tactics. What bothers me most isn't the possibility that Bigfoot exists. It's the intelligence behind what happened. Those creatures, whatever they were, worked together. They communicated, coordinated, and deliberately terrified us. They waited until we were separated, vulnerable. They knew exactly what would frighten humans the most, and they let Tiger come back unharmed, almost like a message. We could have hurt what you love, but we didn't. I still wake up sometimes hearing those sounds, the hoots and that horrible, not quite human laughter. I can still feel those eyes watching from the darkness. And I wonder if they're watching the new owners now, or if they've moved deeper into the woods, away from human contact. All I know for certain is that something lives in those woods, something intelligent, something that doesn't want us there. And sometimes, in my darkest thoughts, I wonder if they're watching me even now, hundreds of miles away. Because once they know you, how can you be sure they've ever really let you go? Story 3. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. Growing up in Southern California, you hear all sorts of stories, ghost tales, UFO sightings, and of course Bigfoot encounters. I always laughed them off. My wife Maria says I don't believe anything I hear and only half of what I see. She's right. I need proof, concrete evidence. But something happened last weekend that I still can't explain, and it's been keeping me up at night. Our family has this tradition of going fishing at Vail Lake in Temecula a few times each year. It's about an hour from our house in Riverside, and it's usually peaceful, just what we need to escape the daily grind. My wife and I have 4 kids, Miguel, 17, Daniel, 15, Sophia, 10, and little Emilio, who's only 7. The older boys love fishing as much as I do, while the younger ones mostly splash around and collect rocks. This past Saturday started like any other fishing trip. We arrived around 2 in the afternoon, set up our camp, and then headed down to our favorite fishing spot around 4. It's this little inlet on the east side of the lake where the shoreline curves inward, creating a calm pocket of water that's usually good for catching bass. The spot is kind of secluded, with these large boulders scattered around and scrubby vegetation typical of Southern California. Not dense forest or anything, just patchy manzanita bushes, some scrub oak, and a few larger trees. We were setting up our gear, putting worms on hooks, getting the cooler positioned right, laying out our folding chairs, when Maria nudged me. "Carlos, who's that over there?" she asked, pointing toward a large boulder about 200 yards away, across a small bay of the lake. I squinted against the late afternoon sun. There was definitely someone there, a large figure squatting beside the boulder, partially in its shade. From that distance, all I could make out was that it was big and seemed to be watching us. "Probably just another fisherman scoping out spots," I said, turning back to my tackle box. We get territorial about our fishing spots sometimes, but there was plenty of lake for everyone. But over the next hour, something felt off. Every time I glanced up, that figure was still there, in exactly the same position. Not moving, not fishing, just watching. Miguel noticed it too. "Dad, that guy's still staring at us." I frowned and really looked this time. The figure hadn't moved at all. It was in a deep squat beside the boulder, elbows seemingly resting on its knees, and it was big. Even from a distance I could tell it was massive, especially considering it was in a squatting position. "Maybe he's meditating or something," I suggested, but I didn't believe that myself. Daniel had wandered over with his binoculars. "That's weird," he said after taking a look. "I don't see any fishing gear. And Dad, I don't think he's wearing clothes, or at least not normal clothes. It's like, I don't know, it looks furry or something." I borrowed the binoculars, but couldn't make out much more detail than Daniel had. The figure was in shadow, and the glare off the lake made it hard to see clearly. But Daniel was right. There was no fishing pole, no tackle box, nothing you'd expect to see. Sophia came up and tugged on my shirt. "Daddy, I don't like that man looking at us." That's when I realized we'd all been fishing for over an hour, and none of us had caught anything. We were all distracted by this observer. As the sun began to lower toward the mountains, casting longer shadows across the lake, I started getting genuinely concerned. The figure hadn't moved, not once, in nearly 2 hours. No human could maintain that squatting position for that long without shifting at least a little. And there was something else bothering me. There was no clear trail to where this figure was positioned. The terrain around that boulder was steep and rocky, with thick brush. It would be difficult to access on foot, which made me wonder how they got there in the first place. Around 6:30, with the sun setting, I decided to try something. "Hey!" I called out across the water, my voice echoing slightly. "You doing okay over there?" No response, not even a twitch. Miguel joined in. "What are you looking at?" he yelled, with the boldness only teenagers have. Still nothing. The figure remained perfectly still, dark against the fading light. Maria grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin. "Carlos, I don't like this. Something's not right. I could feel goosebumps forming on my arms despite the warm evening. The whole situation felt unnatural, wrong somehow. "Let's pack up the little ones and head back to camp," Maria whispered, glancing nervously at Sophia and Emilio, who were now huddled together by our cooler, clearly sensing the tension. I nodded. "You take them up. Miguel, Daniel and I will stay a bit longer to catch something for dinner." That was the excuse anyway. The truth was, I couldn't just walk away. I needed to understand what we were seeing. Maria quickly gathered Sophia and Emilio, along with some of our gear, and headed up the path to our campsite. I could hear Emilio asking questions as they left, his voice high and worried. "Dad, this is creeping me out," Daniel admitted once they were gone. "It's been like 3 hours and that thing hasn't moved an inch." The sun was setting rapidly now, the light fading to deep blue across the lake. In the growing darkness, the figure was becoming harder to see clearly, but it was still there, a dark silhouette against the boulder. "Let's try one more time," I said, my mouth dry. Together, the three of us called out, our voices carrying across the now still water. "Hey, the lake's closing soon. You need to head in." "Are you okay over there? Do you need help?" Only silence answered us. The chirping of crickets had started, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. But from the figure, nothing. As it got darker, I realized something that sent a chill through me. Even in the fading light, I could tell the figure was massive. Whatever was squatting there had shoulders that seemed impossibly broad, and despite the dim light, I could swear its eyes were reflecting, just the faintest gleam, like an animal's eyes catching the last rays of the setting sun. "Dad." Miguel's voice cracked slightly. My 17-year-old son, who thought he was too cool to show fear, sounded genuinely scared. "I don't think that's a person." I swallowed hard. "Let's pack up." We gathered our things quickly, fumbling in the growing darkness. None of us turned our backs to the lake, to the figure as we worked. I kept glancing up, expecting it to be gone, or worse, to see it moving toward us. But it remained in place, watching, waiting. The walk back to our campsite felt longer than usual. We kept looking over our shoulders, half expecting to see something following us up the path. When we finally reached the campsite, Maria had a fire going and the tent set up. The younger kids were inside already, but I could tell from Maria's face that Sophia had been crying. "What was it?" she asked immediately. I shook my head. "I don't know, but it wasn't normal. No one could stay in that position for hours without moving." That night, huddled around the campfire, we talked about what we'd seen. The kids suggested everything from a prank to a statue someone had placed there. But we all knew those explanations didn't make sense. There was no way to get a statue to that spot without a boat or some serious equipment. And it would have been visible to other visitors before, and if it was a prank, it was an incredibly dedicated one. "What if?" Daniel started, then seemed embarrassed to continue. "What?" I prompted. "What if it was a Bigfoot or something? I know that sounds stupid, but..." I would normally have laughed at this suggestion, but after what we'd witnessed, I couldn't. "Temecula isn't exactly Bigfoot territory," I said instead. "It's not like we're in the Pacific Northwest with dense forests." "But there are mountains nearby," Miguel pointed out. "And there have been sightings in Southern California before. I read about them online." I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound outside our tent made me tense up. The wind through the trees, the distant splash of fish jumping in the lake. All of it seemed menacing somehow. At dawn, Miguel woke me up. "Dad, I want to go check it out." "What? No way," I said immediately. "The sun's coming up. It'll be completely safe. I just want to see if there's any evidence, footprints or something." I hesitated, then nodded. "Fine, but I'm coming with you." We woke up Daniel too, and the three of us headed back to our fishing spot as the morning light spread across the lake. Everything looked different in the daylight, less threatening, more familiar. When we reached our spot from yesterday, I pointed across to the boulder. "There, that's where it was." Miguel already had his binoculars out. I don't see anything now. We decided to try to get closer. There was a narrow game trail that wound around the lake's edge, and though it would take us about 30 minutes to reach the boulder, it seemed worth investigating. The walk was tense. Every snapping twig made us jump. When we finally reached the area, we approached cautiously, not sure what we might find. The spot where the figure had been squatting was obvious, a flattened area in the dirt beside the boulder. But what made my skin crawl were the footprints. They were huge, easily 16 inches long, and deeply pressed into the hard soil. Whatever had made them was heavy, and they didn't look human. The shape was wrong, too wide at the front, with what looked like claw marks at the ends of the toes. Daniel knelt down, his hand hovering over one of the prints. "Dad," I couldn't find words. This couldn't be real, yet here was evidence that something very large had been squatting there, watching my family for hours. We followed the tracks as best we could. They led away from the boulder, up into the scrubby hills that bordered the lake. After about 50 yards, we lost them in the rocky terrain. We didn't stay at Vale Lake that day. We packed up our camp and headed home before noon, making excuses to the younger kids about bad fishing and better spots elsewhere. On the drive home, Maria kept looking in the rear-view mirror as if expecting to see something following our car. It's been 5 days now, and I still can't explain what we saw. I've researched Bigfoot sightings in Southern California and found more than I expected. The San Bernardino Mountains, the Cleveland National Forest. There are reports going back decades. But Vale Lake, it never crossed my mind. I keep replaying everything in my head. The unnatural stillness, the size, those prints in the dirt. I've always been the skeptic, the one who needs proof. But now, I'm not sure what to believe anymore. All I know is that something was watching us that day, something that could remain perfectly still for hours, something large enough to leave prints that still make my heart race when I think about them. And whatever it was, it's still out there in the hills around Vale Lake. I haven't told anyone outside my family about this until now. They'd think I was crazy. Hell, sometimes I wonder if I am, but I know what I saw. And I know I'm never going back to that fishing spot again. Story 4. It was early September 2009, a Wednesday night if I remember correctly. I'd been visiting my sister over in Monroeville and stayed later than I planned. We got to talking about Mom's health issues, and before I knew it, it was after 10 at night. The drive back to my place in Frisco City usually takes about 30 minutes, mostly on these narrow back roads cutting through dense pine forests. I remember it was unusually dark that night. No moon to speak of, and once you get away from town, there are no streetlights out there. Just pitch black with my headlights carving out this tunnel of visibility. I had the radio on low, some late-night talk show I wasn't really listening to, just to have some background noise. About 15 minutes into my drive, I hit this long straightaway. It's maybe a quarter mile of perfectly straight road before it curves around a bend. My headlights reached all the way to the end of it, and that's when I first noticed something. At first I thought it was just a deer. We get them all the time around here, and hitting one can total your car, so I slowed down a bit. As I got closer, though, I realized whatever was standing there was much bigger than a deer. It was standing just off the shoulder of the road, right where the tree line starts. Still thinking it might be some kind of animal, I slowed down even more. My car was practically crawling by this point. The rational part of my brain was telling me to just speed up and drive past, but curiosity got the better of me. When I was about 50 feet away, I could see it clearly enough to know it wasn't any animal I recognized. It was standing upright, completely still. I remember my hands starting to shake on the steering wheel. As I got closer, maybe 30 feet away now, I could make out more details. And that's when my mind started struggling to process what I was seeing. This thing was huge. I'm guessing between 7 and 8 feet tall. It was covered in this dark brown hair that hung straight down from its body. Not matted or curly like a bear's, but straight, almost like human hair, but covering its entire body. The hair wasn't super long, maybe 4 or 5 inches, but long enough to hang and move slightly in the breeze. I slowed down even more, my car barely moving now. I was maybe doing 5 miles per hour. Part of me wanted to stop completely, but another part, the smarter part, kept my foot on the gas, if only barely. When I got within about 10 feet, my headlights fully illuminated it. I could see everything. God, I wish I couldn't remember it so clearly, but every detail is burned into my memory. Its body was proportioned kind of like a human, but wrong somehow. It had this massive, thick chest that tapered down to a narrower waist. Its arms were unnaturally long, hanging down to its knees. The hands, I could see its hands, were large with visible fingers, not paws. But its face, that's what keeps me up at night. The face wasn't covered in hair like the rest of it. It had this dark tan skin, leathery looking, with deep creases. Its eyes were large and deeply set under these prominent brow ridges. They looked almost black in my headlights. The nose was broad and flat, with wide nostrils that seemed to flare slightly. It had this strong, square jaw that made its face look almost rectangular. As I passed directly beside it, no more than 10 feet away, the thing turned its head to look at me. It didn't move its body at all, just slowly rotated its head to follow my car. That's when it pulled back its lips and showed me its teeth. They weren't like human teeth at all. They were long and pointed, all of them, not just the canines. They went across its entire mouth like a row of small daggers. Its eyes never blinked. Not once, just these deep black pools staring directly at me as I drove past. There was intelligence in those eyes, not animal intelligence, something else, something that understood exactly what I was and was making a decision about me. I remember my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were ice cold and shaking, but strangely, I didn't scream or panic right away. It was like my brain couldn't process what was happening fast enough to react. I just kept driving, slowly, past this thing, making eye contact with it the entire time. Once I rounded the bend and it was out of sight, that's when the fear really hit me. I slammed my foot on the accelerator so hard the tires squealed. I was shaking uncontrollably, struggling to keep the car on the road. I remember repeatedly checking my rearview mirror, terrified I'd see it running after my car. I made it home in record time. I locked every door and window in my house and sat up all night with all the lights on. I couldn't even call anyone. Who would believe me? What would I even say? Hey, I just saw Bigfoot on County Road 41. I'd sound insane. For weeks afterward, I took the long way home, adding almost 45 minutes to my drive just to avoid that stretch of road. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen, not even my husband, especially not my daughter. I didn't want to scare her. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a bear standing weirdly or something. But I knew better. I know what I saw. Then, about 6 months later, March 1st, 2010, my daughter Ellie came home white as a sheet. She'd been over at her friend's place in Monroeville and was driving back home around 4 in the afternoon. Broad daylight. She was taking the same route I had been on that night. She came bursting through the door, visibly shaken. "Mom," she said, "I saw something weird on the drive home." My blood ran cold immediately. I asked her what she meant, trying to keep my voice steady. She described driving along that same straightaway when she noticed a tall, dark figure standing near the tree line, almost the exact same spot where I'd seen it. She said it was far enough away that she couldn't make out details, but it was definitely standing upright, was extremely tall, and was covered in dark hair or fur. She said as soon as her car approached, the figure turned and stepped into the trees, disappearing from view in seconds. I tried to stay calm, asking her questions while trying not to lead her or show how terrified I was. Everything she described, the location, the height, the way it moved, matched what I had seen. The only mercy was that she hadn't gotten close enough to see its face or those teeth. That night, I finally told her about my experience. We stayed up late, comparing details, confirming to each other that we weren't crazy. There was something out there in those woods, something that had been there for months, maybe years, something that was still there. We've both seen documentaries about Bigfoot sightings, read articles online about similar encounters. Everything matches, the height, the hair, the proportions, but none of the descriptions I've read mention those teeth or that unblinking stare. Nothing prepared me for how intelligent it seemed, how deliberate. We reported it to the local sheriff eventually, but you can imagine how that went. They were polite enough, but I could see them exchanging glances, probably figuring we were just hysterical women or attention seekers. They said they'd keep an eye out, but nothing ever came of it. I've driven that road countless times since then, always during daylight hours, always scanning the trees. I've never seen it again, but I feel watched every time. Sometimes I think I catch movement in my peripheral vision, or hear something large moving through the underbrush parallel to the road. I've learned to speed up during that straightaway, no matter what. The strange thing is, I don't think it meant to harm me that night. It could have easily stepped onto the road, could have reached out and grabbed my car if it wanted to, but it just stood there, watching, like it was studying me as much as I was studying it. That's almost more terrifying somehow. I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened. Was it warning me away, marking its territory, or was it just as curious about me as I was about it? I've read that the forests in Alabama are some of the most dense and least explored in the eastern United States. There are vast stretches where people rarely go. What else might be living out there, just beyond our headlights? I still haven't told many people about this. My husband knows now, and a few close friends, but most people would think I'm crazy. Sometimes I wonder if I am. But then I remember my daughter saw it too, independently months later. Something was there, something is still there. Every now and then I hear stories from other locals. Nothing as direct as my encounter, but strange noises in the night, livestock acting spooked, unusual tracks found in muddy areas. It makes me wonder how many others have seen what I saw, but are too afraid to talk about it. I still live in the same house, still drive those same roads. Life goes on, but I never drive that stretch at night anymore, and I always keep my doors locked now, even during the day. Because the thing that haunts me most isn't just that these creatures exist, it's that one of them knows exactly what I look like, exactly what car I drive, and exactly where I was heading that night. Story 5. I'm still trying to make sense of what I saw that night last September. I've gone over it 1,000 times in my head, trying to rationalize it, but there's just no logical explanation. I live outside Eatonville, Washington, in a double-wide trailer on about 3 acres of land. Nothing fancy, but it's peaceful and private. Our property backs right up to dense forest, the kind where the trees grow so thick that even during the day, it's dim and shadowy just a few yards in. I've always been a skeptic about paranormal stuff. Bigfoot, ghosts, aliens. I'd roll my eyes whenever my hunting buddies would start telling their campfire stories. That changed on September 18th, 2019. It was a Wednesday night, just after midnight. My wife had gone to bed, but I was still wide awake. I'd been having trouble sleeping for a few weeks due to stress at work, so I often found myself wandering around outside in the quiet hours. That night, I was standing near the end of my gravel driveway, talking to my brother on the phone. He lives in Oregon and works nights, so our late-night calls had become a regular thing. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light that I could see pretty clearly across our property without a flashlight. We were just chatting about nothing important. His kids, my job, normal stuff. I remember I was facing toward the field that separates our yard from the tree line, about 100 yards of open grass that I mow maybe twice a month during summer. Mid-sentence, I noticed movement. At first, I thought it might be deer. We get them all the time, and they're bold enough to come right up to the house sometimes. But something about the movement pattern made me pause. These weren't deer. They were too tall, too deliberate in their movements. "Hold on," I told my brother, cutting him off. "There's something in my field." Two figures were moving side by side across the open space, walking from the left side of my property toward the right, parallel to the tree line. They weren't rushing, just steadily moving. The one in front was massive. I'm not exaggerating when I say it must have been 7 or 8 feet tall. I could gauge its height against a young maple at the edge of the field that I know is about 10 feet high. This thing was nearly as tall. The second figure was smaller, maybe 6 feet, but moving strangely. Hunched over, sometimes dropping to all fours for a few steps before straightening up again. The way they moved was so fluid, so natural, but nothing like how a human moves. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wasn't scared exactly, more like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. I remember whispering into the phone, "You're not going to believe this." "What? What is it?" my brother kept asking, but I couldn't even form words to describe it. Without thinking, I moved closer to the house and hissed, "Jenny, turn on the floodlights." My wife had installed motion sensor floodlights earlier that year, but I needed the manual ones that light up the whole backfield. A few seconds later, the yard blazed with light, pushing back the darkness and illuminating the field. That's when I got my first clear look at them, about 100 yards away. The bigger one, I still struggle to call it what I think it was, turned its upper body toward me while still walking forward. That movement alone was unnatural, like it could rotate its torso independently from its legs. The light revealed a massive, bulky figure covered in what looked like dark brown or black hair, but what really got me was its head, or lack thereof almost. It had a round head that seemed to sit directly on enormously broad shoulders with no visible neck, just a round shape on top of a massive frame. The smaller one didn't turn to look, but I could see it better now too, covered in the same dark hair, but moving with a different gait, almost like a juvenile mimicking the larger one, but not quite mastering it. I was frozen in place, phone still pressed to my ear, my brother repeatedly asking what was happening. I finally managed to say, "There are two. I don't know what they are. They're walking across my field." When the floodlights came on, both creatures simultaneously dropped lower in the grass. Not like they were startled, more like a practiced response. They didn't run or panic. They just smoothly crouched down, became smaller targets, and continued moving, now more deliberately, toward the deeper trees at the back of the field. "I'm watching them go into the woods," I whispered. They're not human, man. They're not bears either. I don't know what the hell I'm looking at." I stood there for probably 5 more minutes after they disappeared into the tree line, just staring, half expecting them to re-emerge. My brother kept telling me to go inside, lock the doors. I finally did, but I couldn't tear myself away from the window. Jenny was asking questions, but I couldn't even begin to explain what I'd seen. Around 2 in the morning, as Jenny had finally fallen back asleep and I was sitting in the dark living room staring out the window, I heard it, a scream from the woods, not like anything I've ever heard before. It started as a long, drawn-out howl, almost like a wolf, but much deeper, much more powerful. Then halfway through it changed pitch, rising higher before cutting off abruptly. The silence that followed was worse than the scream itself. I didn't sleep that night, or much for the next week. For at least a month afterward, I wouldn't go outside after dark without a powerful flashlight and my 2 German shepherds. Those dogs had always been protective, but after that night, they started acting differently too. They'd stand at the edge of the yard, staring into the trees, hackles raised but never barking, just watching, like they knew something was out there. I might have eventually convinced myself I'd imagined it all, or that it was just some weird trick of the moonlight, except for what happened with my neighbor, Bill. He lives about half a mile down the road, and we ran into each other at the local hardware store about 3 weeks after my experience. "You heard those weird screams last month?" he asked casually as we were checking out. My blood ran cold. "What screams?" "Like nothing I've ever heard before. he said, shaking his head. Woke me and the wife up around 2:30 in the morning. Sounded like it was coming from the woods between our properties. I asked him what night it was, and sure enough, it matched. Then he mentioned something else. He'd been finding his metal trash cans tossed across his yard, lids completely removed, not just knocked off. Nothing seemed to be eaten or taken, just examined and scattered. That's when I finally told someone what I'd seen. Bill didn't laugh or look at me like I was crazy. He just listened, nodding occasionally, his face getting more serious as I described the figures. You know, he said when I finished, my granddad used to talk about things in these woods, said the loggers would find huge footprints sometimes, or hear wood knocks echoing through the trees when they knew no one else was out there. Over the next few months, I started paying more attention to the stories from local hunters. One guy at the feed store talked about finding a line of tracks after a light snow, tracks that measured nearly 16 inches long. Another mentioned seeing shadowy figures moving between trees at dusk, too big to be human, but moving on two legs. I've always been a rational person. I work in construction, deal with concrete facts and measurements all day. But what I saw that night doesn't fit into my understanding of the world. These weren't people in suits. The movement was too natural, too fluid. The proportions were wrong for humans. And that sound, I still hear it in my dreams sometimes. I'm convinced now that there are things living in these forests that most people never see. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call them. I think they're real. I think they move through these woods regularly, watching us, mostly staying hidden, but occasionally letting themselves be glimpsed. The weirdest part is that I don't feel threatened by what I saw. Unsettled, yes, changed, absolutely, but not in danger. It felt like I witnessed something going about its business, something that had probably walked that same path many times before, maybe even watching my house, observing our routines. The way the larger one turned to look at me, it wasn't surprised to see me there. It knew exactly where I was standing. I've installed more security cameras now, pointing toward the field and woods. So far, I haven't captured anything conclusive, just occasional shadows moving between trees that could be explained away. But I know what I saw. Sometimes at night, I still stand by my window and look out across that field. My wife thinks I'm crazy, but she didn't see them. She didn't see how naturally they moved, how at home they were crossing that open space. I keep wondering if they'll come back, if they're still out there watching. Just last week, I found something strange near the edge of the woods. A small pile of branches that had been deliberately stacked in a way that couldn't have happened naturally. Nothing conclusive, nothing I could show someone as proof, but enough to make me wonder. I don't tell many people about what I saw. Most would think I'm making it up or that I was tired and seeing things, but I know what I saw. That night changed everything for me. The world feels bigger now, more mysterious. And every time I look into those dark woods behind my property, I can't help but feel like something might be looking back. Story 6. I still can't shake what happened that day back in August of 2002. I've never been the type to believe in all that supernatural stuff, but what I saw that evening outside Bankston has haunted me for over 20 years now. I've only told a few people about it. My wife, my brother, and one close friend. Most folks around here would think I'm crazy, but I know what I saw. I own about 30 acres just outside of town. It's mostly wooded land that backs up to a much larger tract that was owned by one of those big timber companies. Back in the summer of 2002, they started logging the property that borders mine. I wasn't too happy about it at first, all the noise and the way they were tearing up the landscape. But after a while, I got into the habit of walking through the logged areas after the crews went home for the day, usually around 3 in the afternoon. There was something fascinating about seeing how the land changed. Areas that were once dense forest suddenly opened up, revealing contours and features I'd never seen before. I'd often walk along the ridgelines where you could get a good view of everything. I'd been doing this for about 2 weeks without incident. On this particular day in late August, it was hot as hell, but not unbearable. The sky was clear, and there was a slight breeze. I remember wearing my old camo pants, a grey t-shirt, and my trusty hiking boots. I brought along a bottle of water and my hunting knife. Not that I expected trouble, it's just something I always carried in the woods. I'd been walking for maybe 45 minutes when something just felt off. You know that feeling when the hair on the back of your neck stands up for no apparent reason? That's what hit me. I've spent my whole life in these woods, and I've learned to trust my instincts. The logging had created this weird patchwork landscape. Some areas completely cleared, while others still had clusters of trees they hadn't gotten to yet. I was following a ridge crest with drop-offs on both sides when I heard this massive crash about 70 yards away to my left. It sounded exactly like a tree falling, and my first thought was that maybe the loggers had left one partially cut that finally gave way. But then I remembered they'd been working in a different section that day. I stopped dead in my tracks, scanning the area where the sound came from. That's when I caught movement to my right, something big moving between 2 pine trees. Those trees were about 6 feet apart, and whatever this thing was, it moved between them with ease. It was only visible for maybe 2 seconds at most, but I could see it was covered in brown hair and moved with this long, powerful stride. My breath caught in my throat. My brain was trying to make sense of what I'd just seen, a bear. No, the movement was all wrong, and it was walking upright. A hunter in a ghillie suit? No way. This thing was massive. I stood frozen for a good 5 minutes, straining to hear or see anything else, but there was nothing. The woods had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. And if you know anything about being in the woods, that silence is never a good sign. I'm not ashamed to admit I got out of there pretty quickly. I didn't run. I'm smart enough to know that running can trigger a predator's chase instinct. But I walked briskly back to my property, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I got home, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was just a black bear standing on its hind legs momentarily. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. What I saw moved with purpose, with a gait that was disturbingly human-like, yet not human at all. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I went back to the spot where I'd seen the figure move between the trees. I'm 6'1", and when I stood between those same pines and reached up, my fingertips barely brushed the lowest branches. Whatever I saw must have been at least 7 or 8 feet tall. I also noticed something else, a weird, musky odor hanging in the air that hadn't been there before, kind of like wet dog mixed with something rotten. I found myself obsessing over it for the next week. I'd always scoffed at Bigfoot stories, thought they were just tall tales for tourists and TV shows, but now I wasn't so sure anymore. About a week later, I decided to go back. I know that sounds stupid, but I had to know if what I saw was real, or if my mind had been playing tricks on me. This time I went later in the day, around 6 in the evening. The light was starting to get that golden quality it gets before sunset. I brought my camera this time, just an old point-and-shoot digital, nothing fancy. I followed the same trail up to the ridge. Everything seemed normal. Birds were singing, squirrels were darting around. I felt silly for being so spooked the week before. I was walking along, taking a few photos of the sunset through the trees, when I rounded a bend in the trail and froze. There it was, standing just 15 feet in front of me. I swear to God, time seemed to stop. It was like my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. It was enormous, easily between 7 and 8 feet tall. The creature was covered in dark brown hair, almost black in some places. The hair was thickest across its shoulders and chest, but thinner on its face, allowing me to see its features clearly. Its body was solid muscle, not bulky like a weightlifter, but powerful like those strongman competitors. Its arms hung longer than a human should, with massive hands ending in what looked like black or dark grey nails or claws. But it was the face that burned itself into my memory. Large, deep-set eyes under a heavy brow ridge stared directly into mine. They were dark. I couldn't tell if they were brown or black, but they were intelligent. That's the only word I can use. There was awareness there, a consciousness looking back at me. It had a wide, flat nose and a mouth with visible teeth that looked yellowed or stained. We just stood there, staring at each other. My camera was in my hand, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even think to raise it and take a picture. It felt like we were locked in that moment for an eternity, but it was probably only about 10 seconds. Then, without warning, it slowly turned its head to the side, as if listening for something I couldn't hear. It took one step backward, then another, moving with an eerie silence that something so large shouldn't be capable of. It disappeared into the shadows between the trees, and despite staring at that spot for several minutes afterward, I never saw it emerge. My legs were shaking so badly I had to sit down right there on the trail. I don't know how long I sat there. Could have been 5 minutes or 30. Eventually, I got up and practically ran all the way back to my house. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those intelligent eyes staring back at me. The weird thing is, I never felt threatened during our encounter. Terrified, yes, but not because it seemed aggressive. It was more the shock of seeing something that shouldn't exist, something that completely upended my understanding of the world. I've never gone back to that specific trail. I still walk my property, but I stick to the areas closer to my house. I've never seen the creature again, though in the years since, I've occasionally heard strange sounds coming from the woods at night, howls and moans that don't match any animal I know. They're rare, maybe happening once or twice a year, and always from the direction of that ridge. I've done a lot of research since then, read accounts from other people who claim to have seen similar things. Some of their descriptions match what I saw so closely it gives me chills. I've thought about reporting it to one of those Bigfoot research groups, but I've held back. This is a small town, and I don't want to be known as that crazy Bigfoot guy. The logging company finished their work and moved on by the end of that year. The forest is slowly reclaiming the land they cleared, and sometimes I wonder if that's what disturbed the creature in the first place, humans encroaching on its territory. I still can't explain what I saw that day. Was it a Bigfoot, a Sasquatch, or whatever you want to call it? I don't know. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and it changed how I see the world. There are things in these woods that science hasn't explained, things that most people would never believe unless they saw them with their own eyes. Sometimes, when I'm outside at dusk and hear the wind moving through the trees, I wonder if it's still out there, watching from the shadows. And occasionally, when I'm feeling brave, I'll look toward that ridge and wonder if it remembers me too. Story 7. I still have trouble talking about what happened to me back in summer of 2019. Even typing this makes my hands shake a little. I've been lurking on this forum for months, reading everyone else's experiences, and I finally decided it was time to share mine. That summer, a few buddies and I decided to do a weekend hiking trip in Cherokee National Forest in Tennessee. There were 5 of us: me, Lucas, Jake, Drew, Mitch, and Caleb. We were all in our mid-20s, full of energy and stupid confidence. I'd done plenty of hiking before, but wasn't what you'd call an experienced outdoorsman. I knew enough to pack properly and follow basic safety rules, but I definitely didn't know everything about wildlife behavior, which becomes important later. We hit the trail early on a Saturday morning in July. The weather was perfect, sunny but not too hot, maybe 75 degrees with a light breeze. The forest was absolutely alive with summer. Birds everywhere, bugs buzzing, that rich, earthy smell of soil and vegetation. I remember feeling so good that morning, like everything was right with the world. About 3 hours into our hike, I started getting a bit ahead of the group. I've always been a fast walker, and the others were stopping to take pictures or adjust their packs every 15 minutes. I wasn't trying to be a jerk about it, but I was in a groove and didn't want to break my rhythm. Jake yelled up that it was fine if I went ahead, just to wait at the next trail junction, which was supposed to be about a mile up. As I walked, the forest got denser and quieter. The trail curved around a small hill, and suddenly I heard water. Just off to the right side of the trail, maybe 30 yards through some brush, was this picture-perfect little pond. I could see ripples on the surface and what looked like beaver activity. There was a partial dam on one side and some freshly chewed stumps. Being a nature nerd, I decided to go check it out while waiting for my friends to catch up. I stepped off the trail and started pushing through the underbrush. It was thicker than I expected, lots of mountain laurel and rhododendron that I had to squeeze between. The ground was soft and a bit muddy near the water. I found a good spot on a fallen log where I could watch the pond without disturbing anything. I must have sat there for 15 minutes just watching the water and catching glimpses of what I thought were beavers moving around. Eventually, I figured the guys would be wondering where I was, so I decided to head back to the trail. Instead of going back the exact way I came, I went at a slight angle, thinking it would be a shorter route to the trail. This put me about 30 yards from where I had originally left the path, in an area with even thicker vegetation. That's when everything changed. I was pushing through some dense brush when I heard movement ahead of me, something big enough to make branches snap. My first thought was deer. It's always deer in the woods, right? They bed down in thick cover like this. But then I heard it, this sound that I still can't fully describe. It started as this high-pitched wail that dragged out for what felt like forever. It was like a woman screaming, but wrong. Not human, not animal either. At least, not any animal I recognized. It had this quality that made the hair on my arms stand up instantly. The scream hung in the air for maybe 3 seconds, and then I felt it more than heard it. This rhythmic pounding on the ground, heavy footfalls, running. Whatever made that sound was moving fast along the trail I was trying to get back to. I dropped into a crouch, partly out of fear and partly to see better through the brush. My heart was slamming against my ribs so hard it actually hurt. About 20 yards ahead, there was a small clearing where sunlight broke through the canopy and lit up a section of the trail. Whatever was running passed right through that patch of light, and I got a brief but clear look at it. It was moving on 2 legs, not 4, 2, dark brown, maybe 3.5 to 4.5 feet tall, with hair that looked lighter at the tips. It never dropped to all fours during the few seconds I could see it. It ran with this weird, fluid motion that seemed too smooth for a bear. Its arms swung at its sides. My brain immediately went to bear cub. That was the only thing that made sense. A juvenile black bear that had stood up to run for some reason. And where there's a cub, there's a mama bear who will absolutely destroy anyone who gets near her baby. So I froze completely, barely breathing, straining my ears for any sound of a larger bear nearby. I stayed completely still for what must have been 5 minutes, though it felt like an hour. No sign of a mother bear, no more sounds at all, actually. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, just dead quiet. When I finally got the courage to move, I backtracked the way I'd come, making a wide circle to get back to the trail well away from where the cub had gone. My mind was racing with questions, but fear of a protective mother bear kept me moving quickly and quietly. I met up with my friends about 10 minutes later. They asked where I'd been, and I just said I'd stopped to watch some beavers. I didn't mention what I'd seen or heard. Why? Because I was embarrassed. These guys would have either thought I was making it up for attention, or they'd have laughed at me for being scared of a bear cub. So I kept quiet, and we continued our hike. We made camp that evening at a designated site about 5 miles from where I'd had my encounter. As we sat around the fire after dinner, Mitch suddenly held up his hand. "You guys hear that?" he asked. We all went quiet. In the distance, there was a distinct knocking sound, like someone hitting a tree with a stick. Knock, knock, knock. Then silence for maybe 30 seconds, then 3 more knocks. Probably a woodpecker. Drew said. At night? Jake questioned. Or just branches falling, Caleb suggested. I didn't say anything, but my skin was crawling. The knocking continued on and off for about 20 minutes, then stopped. We went to bed shortly after, and I spent most of the night staring at the roof of my tent, listening for any unusual sounds. The rest of the trip was uneventful, and we hiked out the next day. I put the whole thing out of my mind, or at least I tried to. I convinced myself it was just a bear cub that had been startled and ran off on its hind legs momentarily. Fast forward about 3 years, I was having lunch with a co-worker named Mark who mentioned he liked to camp. We got to talking about different places we'd been, and I mentioned Cherokee National Forest. His face changed instantly. You ever experience anything weird there? He asked in a lowered voice. My stomach dropped. What do you mean by weird? Mark told me that about 5 years before my trip, he'd been camping solo in Cherokee. In the middle of the night, he was awakened by what he described as a woman's scream, but not human. At dawn, as he was making coffee, he glimpsed a dark, hairy figure walking upright at the edge of his campsite. He estimated it was about 7 feet tall. It disappeared into the trees before he could get a better look. The similarities to my experience gave me chills. The scream, the bipedal movement, the same forest. That conversation sent me down a rabbit hole of research. I learned that bear cubs don't typically run on 2 legs for extended periods. They might stand up or take a few steps, but not run at speed the way what I saw did. And the more I learned about bear vocalizations, the more I realized that what I heard didn't match up. Then I stumbled across recordings of what people call Bigfoot howls or Sasquatch screams. The first time I played one, I nearly dropped my phone. It was deeper than what I'd heard, but the pattern and quality were eerily similar. It brought back the whole experience in vivid detail. The knocking sounds we heard at camp that night, apparently that's another thing commonly reported in Bigfoot encounters. Wood knocks that seem to be some form of communication. I'm not saying definitively that what I saw was a juvenile Sasquatch. I still try to maintain some skepticism, but I've spent hundreds of hours in the woods since then, heard all kinds of wildlife, seen bears and deer and everything else, and nothing matches what I experienced that day. I still hike in Cherokee Forest and the Smokies. I haven't had another encounter like that one. But I'm much more aware now. I pay attention when the woods go quiet. I listen for unusual sounds, and I never, ever hike alone anymore. What bothers me most isn't the possibility that these creatures might exist. It's the fact that I was so close to one and had no idea what I was looking at. How many other hikers have similar experiences and just write them off as known wildlife? How many odd sightings get dismissed because we're too embarrassed to talk about them? I don't know what's out there in the Tennessee wilderness, but I'm convinced it wasn't a bear or a deer I saw that day. And whatever made that scream, it still haunts my dreams. Story 8. I've been debating whether to share this for almost 20 years now. I'm not the type who goes looking for attention or believes in things without evidence. But what I saw back in 2004 has stayed with me, crystal clear, despite how much I've tried to explain it away. It was August 15th, a Sunday morning. I remember because I had an appointment with a client later that day. I was already running late, which is why everything happened the way it did. I'm a geologist by training, but I've always been an avid rockhound in my spare time. That morning, I'd gotten up at dawn to check out a spot in Sunshine Valley I'd heard about from another collector. The valley was quiet that early. I'd been driving with my windows down, enjoying the crisp morning air before the day heated up. I'd spent about 2 hours collecting some nice specimens, nothing extraordinary, but satisfying enough. I checked my watch and realized I needed to head back if I was going to make my appointment. So I packed up my tools and samples and started driving out along the service road that cuts through the eastern edge of the valley. I was about halfway back to the main road when I noticed movement near a small pond about 200 feet off to my right. At first glance, I thought it was a couple of people fishing. Nothing unusual about that, though it seemed early and a bit remote. As I continued driving, something nagged at me. That pond wasn't right for fishing. It was small, maybe 30 feet across, and I knew from my previous visits it was pretty shallow. Plus, who would be fishing that early in such a remote spot? I slowed down, squinting to get a better look while still rolling forward. That's when I realized what I was seeing wasn't people, not deer or bears either. Standing by that pond were two upright figures covered in what looked like dark brown hair. My first thought was bear, but no, these weren't bears. Bears don't stand upright that long, and they certainly don't have the proportions I was seeing. The larger one was leaning or bending toward the water, but even hunched over, it was taller than the smaller one standing next to it. The smaller one was completely still, facing in my direction, not directly at me, but toward the road. I've worked outdoors for almost my entire career. I've encountered all kinds of wildlife across North America. What I was looking at simply didn't match anything I recognized. My car was still moving, but I'd slowed to maybe 10 miles per hour. I couldn't stop staring. The larger figure was massive, at least 7 feet tall if it had been standing fully upright. Its entire body was covered in dark brown hair, not patchy like a mangy bear, but uniform. The smaller one, which I now believe was a juvenile, had the same dark hair but with a lighter coloration around its face. What struck me most was how they moved. The larger one, I'm guessing the parent, bent down toward the water in this incredibly fluid motion. I could actually see the muscles and shape of its upper thigh and hip as it moved. It wasn't jerky or awkward like someone in a costume. It was steady, deliberate, natural. I've seen plenty of mammals move in the wild, and this had that same organic quality. It moved like a living thing that had evolved to move exactly that way. I should have stopped the car. I should have grabbed my camera from the back seat. But I was frozen in a weird mix of fascination and disbelief. Part of my brain was cataloging what I was seeing while another part was screaming that this couldn't be real. The road curved slightly, and as I continued driving, the angle changed. The smaller one, the juvenile, seemed to notice my vehicle. It didn't run or make any sudden movements. It just shifted its stance slightly, turning more directly toward the road. The adult remained focused on whatever it was doing at the water's edge. I had maybe 15 to 20 seconds of clear visibility before trees obscured my view again. In those seconds, I was frantically trying to process what I was seeing. These weren't people in suits. The movements were too natural, the proportions too consistent. These weren't bears, the posture, the way they stood, the shape of the head and shoulders, none of it matched a bear. These weren't any recognized animal I'd ever encountered or studied. As the trees blocked my view, I had this powerful urge to stop, back up, and look again. But I was already late for my appointment, and honestly, part of me was afraid. Not that they would hurt me, they showed no aggression whatsoever, but afraid of confronting something that challenged everything I thought I knew. I accelerated and continued on, my heart pounding. I checked my rearview mirror repeatedly, half expecting to see one of them emerge onto the road behind me, but there was nothing. When I reached the main highway, I pulled over and sat there for a good 10 minutes, trying to calm down and make sense of what I'd just witnessed. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't even write notes. I tried to sketch what I'd seen in my field notebook, but the drawings don't do justice to what I observed. I made it to my appointment 40 minutes late. I must have seemed distracted because my client asked if I was feeling okay. I mumbled something about not sleeping well and managed to get through the meeting. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying those 15 to 20 seconds over and over in my mind. The fluid movement of the larger creature, the stillness of the smaller one, the way they seemed completely at ease in their environment until they noticed my car. I didn't tell anyone at first. I'm a scientist by training. I deal in observable, measurable facts. What was I supposed to say? Hey, I saw Bigfoot today. 2 of them, actually. I knew how that would sound. I've never been the person who sees things that aren't there. I don't drink. I don't do drugs. I've never had hallucinations. I'm the rational one in my friend group, the skeptic. But after a few days of private torment, I called my closest friend, Sarah, who's a wildlife biologist. I told her I needed to talk about something weird I'd seen, and we met for coffee. When I described what I'd observed, she didn't laugh or dismiss me. She asked careful, detailed questions about the light conditions, about the distance, about how the creatures moved, about their proportions relative to the surrounding vegetation. She took me seriously, which somehow made the whole experience even more unsettling. "If it were anyone else telling me this, Claire," she said, "I'd assume they were confused or exaggerating, but I know how you observe things." A week later, I worked up the courage to drive back to that spot. It was stupid to go alone, but I didn't want witnesses to what might be a wild goose chase. I parked my car and walked the half-mile to the pond. I looked for tracks, for hair caught on branches, for anything that might confirm what I'd seen. I found nothing conclusive. Some broken branches, some areas where the vegetation was pressed down, but nothing that couldn't be explained by deer or other wildlife. The pond itself was exactly as I remembered it. Small, shallow, ringed with cattails on one side. I stood there for nearly an hour, hoping irrationally that they might return, that I might get confirmation. Nothing happened, of course. In the weeks that followed, I researched Sasquatch sightings in the region. I was surprised by how many reports described similar details: the fluid movement, the proportions, the behavior. I was even more surprised by how many of these reports came from people like me, rational, educated, with nothing to gain from making outlandish claims. I've spent the last 19 years trying to reconcile what I saw with what I believe is possible. I've gone back to that spot at least once a year, always in August, always hoping for another glimpse. I never saw them again. Some people have suggested I saw bears, possibly with mange or some other condition that affected their appearance. But I know what bears look like, how they move. These weren't bears. Others have suggested I saw people in costumes, maybe filming something or playing a prank. But the movement was wrong for that. No costume I've ever seen allows for that kind of natural articulation. And who would be out there, in that remote spot, at that early hour, in elaborate costumes? The most disturbing suggestion came from a neurologist friend who gently proposed I might have experienced a brief focal seizure that affected my visual processing. I actually had an MRI after that conversation. It came back normal. The truth is, I know what I saw. Two creatures, almost certainly a parent and child, going about their morning at a remote pond. They weren't doing anything extraordinary, just existing in their habitat, maybe getting a drink or looking for food in the water. It was such a mundane scene in a way, which makes it all the more convincing to me. If my brain were making something up, wouldn't it create a more dramatic encounter? What I witnessed that morning has fundamentally changed how I see the world. I no longer assume we've catalogued every living thing in our forests. I no longer dismiss accounts of the unexplained quite so readily. I've become more humble about the limits of our knowledge. I still work as a geologist, still spend time outdoors collecting rocks and minerals. But now, when I'm in remote areas, I scan the tree line differently. I listen more carefully. I leave less trace. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the wilderness, I get the distinct feeling I'm being watched, not with malice, but with the same curiosity I felt that morning in Sunshine Valley. I don't know what to call what I saw. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, an undiscovered primate. The label doesn't matter. What matters is that they exist, or at least they did on that August morning 19 years ago. And I can't help but wonder how many other people have seen them and, like me, hesitated to share their story for fear of ridicule or disbelief. I'm sharing this now because I'm tired of questioning my own experience. I'm tired of the weight of keeping this to myself. I know what I saw. I was clear-headed. It was daylight. and I observed them for long enough to be certain, two hair-covered bipedal creatures of different sizes by a pond in Sunshine Valley, moving naturally, existing, real. And I still don't have a satisfying explanation for what they were. Story 9. I've never told this story to anyone outside my immediate family. I've read other accounts online from people who've had similar experiences, which is the only reason I'm sharing this now. It happened over 20 years ago, but I still think about it almost daily. In August of 2001, my girlfriend Sarah and I decided to go camping in the Sawtooth National Forest in Idaho. We specifically chose mid-August, thinking most of the summer crowds would be gone and we'd have some peace and quiet. We both had stressful jobs. I was working at an engineering firm and she was finishing her master's thesis, so we needed to disconnect. We brought our two dogs, Max and Bailey, both German Shepherd mixes that loved the outdoors as much as we did. We picked a spot near Otter Lake, which isn't one of the more popular destinations in the forest. It's a beautiful, crystal-clear lake surrounded by dense pine forest and rolling hills. The water is ice cold, even in summer, fed by mountain runoff. When we arrived on Monday afternoon, there wasn't another soul around, exactly what we'd hoped for. Setting up our campsite about 50 yards from the lake's edge, we had a perfect little spot with a fire ring someone had made previously. We spent Monday and Tuesday hiking, fishing, and just relaxing. The weather was perfect, warm during the day, cool at night. The dogs were having the time of their lives, swimming and exploring. We'd done backcountry camping dozens of times before, so this was our element. I remember commenting to Sarah how perfect it all was. No cell service, no people, just us and nature. Wednesday morning is when everything changed. It was around 9 in the morning, and I was doing some fly fishing at the edge of the lake. Sarah was sitting on a fallen log about 20 feet behind me, drinking coffee and watching the dogs sniff around nearby. The lake was completely still, like glass, with mist rising off it as the morning sun started to warm the air. I was focused on casting when I noticed movement on the opposite shore, maybe 200 yards away. My first thought was bear. We'd seen black bears before while camping, and from that distance it looked like a bear on all fours, drinking at the water's edge. The shape was dark brown against the shoreline. I didn't want to make any sudden movements, so I slowly lowered my fishing rod and whispered to Sarah, "Hey, look across the lake, there's a bear." She set down her coffee mug and carefully stood up to look where I was pointing. That's when it happened. The bear stood up on two legs, but it didn't stand up like a bear does momentarily before dropping back to all fours. This thing stood fully upright and stayed that way. Even from across the lake, we could tell it was massive, much taller than any person I've ever seen. It had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. The entire body was covered in dark brown hair or fur from head to toe. Then it started to walk. That's what really shook me. It didn't lumber or move awkwardly like you'd expect from a bear walking on hind legs. It walked smoothly, purposefully, with a natural gait that looked disturbingly human. Its arms were long, swinging naturally at its sides as it moved. The stride was confident and fluid, like it had been walking on 2 legs its entire life. It moved away from the water toward the tree line, never looking in our direction, seemingly unaware or unconcerned about our presence. The whole sighting probably lasted only 15 or 20 seconds before it disappeared into the trees, but it felt like time had stopped. Neither of us said anything for what seemed like minutes. I remember the feeling that washed over me. It wasn't panic or fear of immediate danger. It was something deeper and more primal. It was the feeling you get when something fundamentally challenges your understanding of reality. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my fishing rod. When I finally turned to look at Sarah, her face had drained of all color. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. I couldn't answer her. I didn't have words. Then I noticed the dogs. Max and Bailey were both dead silent, standing rigid with their ears perked up, staring across the lake. They weren't barking or growling, just staring with an intensity I'd never seen before. Dogs always bark at bears or other wildlife, but they were completely quiet. That silence was somehow more unsettling than if they'd been going crazy. "We need to leave," Sarah said, and I immediately agreed. There was no discussion about trying to get a better look or investigating further. Something deep inside told us both that we needed to get out of there. We practically jogged back to our campsite, constantly looking over our shoulders. The forest that had seemed so peaceful now felt threatening. Every rustle in the underbrush made us jump. The dogs stayed unusually close, not running ahead or exploring like they normally would. We packed up our camp in record time, barely speaking except to coordinate what needed to be done. I remember fumbling with the tent poles, my hands still trembling. Sarah kept scanning the tree line while she rolled up the sleeping bags. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, though I never saw anything. As we were throwing the last of our gear into the car, Sarah suddenly froze, staring into the forest behind our campsite. "Did you hear that?" she asked. I hadn't heard anything, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The dogs were pressed against our legs, trembling slightly. "Let's go," I said, and we piled into the car, dogs in the back seat. I remember the tires spinning in the dirt as I accelerated too quickly down the rough forest road. We didn't speak much during the 3-hour drive home. What was there to say? We both knew what we'd seen wasn't a bear, wasn't a person in a costume, wasn't anything that was supposed to exist in our world. That night, back in our apartment, we finally talked about it. "It was a Bigfoot, wasn't it?" Sarah asked directly. It sounded ridiculous saying it out loud, but we both knew it was true. What else could it have been? The height, the proportions, the way it moved. Nothing else made sense. The next few weeks were strange. We both had trouble sleeping. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I'd heard something outside our bedroom window. Sarah said she kept dreaming about being watched from the trees. The dogs were acting differently too, more alert, more protective, jumping at small noises. We tried to research similar sightings in the Sawtooth area, but found very little concrete information. This was 2001, before smartphones and social media made sharing these experiences easier. The few forums and websites dedicated to Bigfoot sightings seemed full of obviously fake stories or second-hand accounts, nothing like what we'd experienced. We never went back to Otter Lake. In fact, we completely changed our camping habits. No more remote backcountry sites. For years afterward, we only camped at busy, developed campgrounds with plenty of other people around. We'd rather deal with noisy neighbors and lack of privacy than ever feel that profound isolation again. Sarah and I eventually broke up for unrelated reasons, but we still talk occasionally, and when we do, that day inevitably comes up. 22 years later, and we still can't explain it. The memory hasn't faded or changed for either of us. I know how this sounds. I was a skeptical person before this happened, the kind who rolled my eyes at cryptid stories and UFO sightings. Now I don't know what to believe. I just know what I saw. A tall, powerful, hair-covered being that walked like a human, but clearly wasn't one. The strangest part is the lack of fear I felt from the creature itself. It didn't act aggressively or even acknowledge us. It simply went about its business, moving through its world. It was our presence in its territory that felt wrong, not the other way around. I've gone back and forth about whether to share this experience publicly. I don't want to be labeled as crazy or attention-seeking. I have a normal life, a good job, and people who respect me. But I also feel like I'm carrying around this secret that's too big to keep inside. Here's what I know for certain. Something exists in those remote forests that science hasn't catalogued or explained. I saw it with my own eyes, in broad daylight, on a clear morning, completely sober. My girlfriend saw it too. Our dog sensed it. It was real. I've read some theories that these creatures are some kind of undiscovered primate, or possibly even a remnant population of early hominids that somehow survived alongside humans. I don't know about all that. I just know that when it stood up and walked away from that lake, my entire understanding of the natural world changed in an instant. These days, I still go hiking and spend time outdoors, but I'm always aware. I listen differently to sounds in the forest. I scan tree lines and ridges automatically, and I always feel like I'm being watched when I'm in remote areas. That's the lasting impact of what happened. Not terror, but a constant low-level awareness that the wilderness holds secrets we don't understand. I don't expect people to believe me, and I'm not trying to convince anyone. I'm just putting this out there in case someone else has had a similar experience and feels alone with it. You're not crazy. What you saw was real, and you're not the only one. Story 10. I still get goosebumps when I think about that day in Idaho. It was November 2012, and I was on a hunting trip with my stepdad near Yellow Pine. We'd been planning this trip for months. I'd even set up a stand in a promising spot a few days earlier. We drove out before dawn that morning. The air was crisp and biting cold, the kind that makes your lungs hurt a little when you breathe in deep. We parked the truck along this old logging road and got our gear sorted in silence, just the sound of metal against metal as we checked our rifles and loaded our packs. My stepdad pointed to the ridge ahead of us. "I'll take the east slope, you go west. We'll meet back here at sundown." We'd hunted this way before, splitting up to cover more ground. The ridge had this narrow saddle between two steep slopes, and game often passed through there. It was still pitch black when I started hiking to my spot. The forest was dead quiet, except for my boots crunching on frozen leaves and twigs. I used my headlamp sparingly, just enough to see where I was stepping. Around 6 in the morning, I was settling into my first position when I heard it. This deep, powerful whooping call echoed through the darkness from across the ridge. It wasn't close, but it wasn't super far either. I've been hunting since I was 12, and I've heard all kinds of animals: elk bugling, coyotes howling, owls hooting. But this sound was completely different. It was too deep for a coyote, too loud for an owl, and nothing like an elk. It was almost human-like, but not quite. It was a whoop sound that seemed to hang in the air. I remember freezing in place, my breath making little clouds in front of my face. I strained my ears waiting to hear it again, but there was nothing, just silence. I told myself it was probably just some hunter trying to call something in, but the hair on the back of my neck was standing up. The morning hunt was uneventful. I saw a few does at a distance, but nothing worth taking a shot at. Around noon, I ate the sandwich I'd packed and decided to move to my other stand for the afternoon. This second spot was in a thicker part of the woods, where I'd seen promising deer sign earlier in the season. This area always felt different. Even on bright days, the canopy was so thick that it seemed darker than the rest of the forest. Sounds were muffled there too, like the trees absorbed noise instead of letting it travel. The stand overlooked a narrow game trail with these massive boulders behind it, big chunks of granite that looked out of place, like they'd been dropped there by giants. It was about 1:30 in the afternoon when I reached the stand. I remember checking my watch because I was thinking I had about 4 more hours of good daylight. I propped my rifle against a tree and started climbing the ladder to my stand. I was about halfway up when I heard it. A deep, rumbling growl, not like a bear. I've heard plenty of those. This was deeper, more threatening somehow. It made my whole body tense up. Then there was this loud crack, the unmistakable sound of rocks slamming together, hard. I whipped around so fast I nearly fell off the ladder. That's when I saw it, or part of it. Something ducked behind the largest boulder about 40 yards away. I only caught a glimpse, but what I saw made my blood run cold. A large, slightly pointed head and broad shoulders covered in thick dark hair, black or maybe dark brown. The thing moved fast, not like it was running away scared, but like it was deliberately hiding. Time seemed to stop. I was frozen on that ladder, one hand gripping the metal rung so tight my knuckles were white. My rifle was still leaning against the tree below me. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I carefully backed down the ladder, keeping my eyes fixed on that boulder the whole time. My hands were shaking so bad I almost slipped on the bottom rung. I grabbed my rifle and held it ready, not pointing at anything yet, just ready. I started backing away slowly. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn and run, but I knew better. You don't turn your back on predators, and whatever this was, it was definitely a predator. I kept backing up, step by step, never taking my eyes off that boulder. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just my boots crunching on the forest floor and my own ragged breathing. When I was about 100 yards away, it happened. The creature, I don't know what else to call it, peeked out from behind the rock, just for a second. But in that second, our eyes met, and I felt this cold wave of fear wash over me. It was looking right at me, studying me. Then it pulled back behind the boulder just as quickly. That's when I turned and walked away as fast as I could without actually running. I didn't want to trigger a chase response. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, but I never saw it again. The whole way back to camp, I felt like I was being watched. Every shadow, every rustle in the bushes made me jump. When I finally made it back to our campsite, my stepdad was already there, stoking a small fire. He took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. I told him what happened, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't laugh or dismiss it like I thought he might. Instead, he got this serious look on his face and told me that 2 other guys from our hunting group had seen something strange a few weeks earlier near Yellow Pine. They described seeing something tall and black run across the edge of a field. They'd thought it was a bear at first, but it moved wrong, too upright, too fast. We sat there by the fire as the light faded, talking in low voices. I kept replaying what I'd seen in my mind. The thing that struck me most wasn't just how big it was, though those shoulders were massive. It was how it behaved. Animals typically do one of 3 things when they encounter humans. They run away, they freeze, or sometimes they charge. This thing did none of those. It deliberately hid while watching me. That growl and the rock slapping, those seemed like intentional intimidation tactics. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound outside our tent had me wide awake, straining to hear if that deep whooping call would come again. We stayed another day, but I stuck to open areas where I could see in all directions. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It's been over 10 years now, and I've never told many people about what happened. The few I've told usually give me that look, like they think I'm making it up, or that I saw a bear and panicked. But I know what bears look like. This wasn't a bear. I still hunt in that general area, but I stay in the more open terrain now. I've never seen anything like that again, but sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I'll hear rocks clacking together in the distance, and my whole body goes cold. The thing that keeps me up at night isn't just what I saw. It's the intelligence behind those eyes when they locked with mine. There was something calculating there, something that understood exactly what it was doing. And sometimes I wonder, was it warning me to stay away, or was it trying to decide if I was worth hunting? I don't know if it was a Bigfoot. I don't know what it was, but I know what I saw, and I know that the woods don't feel the same to me anymore. There are places I won't go alone now, and that stand near the boulders, I left it there. I'm never going back to that spot again. Story 11. I've gone back and forth about sharing this for years now. Most people would think I'm crazy or looking for attention, but I swear on everything I hold dear that what happened that night in October 2014 was real. I still get chills thinking about it. My son Trevor, who was 17 at the time, my uncle Raymond, 62, and I were bow hunting for deer in the Witta National Forest in Oklahoma. We'd been planning this trip for months, just us guys getting away from everything. Uncle Raymond knew this great spot near a state-planted food plot that supposedly had tons of deer activity. We'd set up our modest camp about 200 yards from the plot. Nothing fancy, just Raymond's old camper and a fire pit. That day, October 17th, had been pretty uneventful. We'd spent most of it scouting game trails and hunting from our portable stands. Didn't see much, just a couple of does too far out to get a clean shot. By the time we all made it back to camp around 10 that night, we were tired but in good spirits. The temperature had dropped to maybe 45 degrees, and we had a decent fire going. Trevor was telling us about how his football coach had been riding him about missing practice for this trip. Raymond was drinking his usual cheap beer and laughing at Trevor's impression of his coach. I remember feeling so content in that moment. Just 3 generations sitting around a campfire in the woods, talking about nothing important. That's when everything changed. At first, it was just a sound in the distance, a deep, resonant whoop that echoed through the trees. We all stopped talking at the same time. "What was that?" Trevor asked, looking at me. "Probably just an owl," I said, but I didn't believe it. I'd been hunting these woods since I was Trevor's age, and I'd never heard an owl make a sound like that. Raymond sat up straighter, his weathered face suddenly serious. "That ain't no owl, Jackson." The sound came again, closer this time. A long, drawn-out whoop that seemed to hang in the air, then another from a slightly different direction. It wasn't a coyote either. The pitch was too deep, too guttural. Then we heard something that made my skin crawl. A low growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was primal, ancient. The hair on my arms stood straight up despite the warmth of the fire. "Dad?" Trevor's voice had gone up an octave. He was trying to act tough, but I could see the fear in his eyes. The sounds continued, seeming to circle our campsite. Not too close, but definitely not far enough away for comfort. It was like whatever was making them was pacing around us, keeping its distance, but letting us know it was there. Raymond suddenly stood up. "I'm getting my light," he announced, heading for the camper. He returned with this massive flashlight he'd bought specially for the trip. One of those super bright LED ones that could light up half a football field. We stood there listening as the whoops and growls continued. Raymond started scanning the edge of the food plot with his light, sweeping it across the tree line about 75 yards away. "See anything?" I whispered, though I'm not sure why I was whispering. "Not yet," Raymond replied, continuing to move the beam methodically across the forest edge. That's when Trevor grabbed my arm. "There, did you see that?" Raymond swung the light back to where Trevor was pointing. At first, I didn't see anything but trees and brush. Then something reflected the light, just for a split second, behind a large bush at the edge of the clearing. Before any of us could say anything, the entire bush began shaking violently, not like when a deer runs through undergrowth. This was powerful, deliberate. The whole bush, which must have been 7 or 8 feet tall, shook for about 10 seconds, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sounds. Then we heard it. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving through the woods behind the food plot. Thump, thump, thump. Whatever was making those footfalls was big, really big. "We need to get inside," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "Now." None of us argued. We practically ran to the camper, piled inside, and locked the door behind us. Raymond turned off his light, and we sat in darkness, listening. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no nightbirds, nothing. That silence was deafening. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the others could hear it. Trevor was breathing fast, his eyes wide in what little moonlight filtered through the camper windows. Raymond sat rigid, his flashlight clutched in his hands like a weapon. "What the hell was that?" Trevor finally whispered. Raymond looked at me, then at Trevor. "I think we all know what it might be," he said quietly. Growing up in Oklahoma, we'd all heard the stories. The locals called it the Wild Man, or sometimes used the Native American names for it, but most people just called it Bigfoot. I'd always written those stories off as campfire tales or misidentified bears, but bears don't make whooping calls, and bears don't pace around a campsite like they're sizing you up. We sat in that dark camper for about an hour, barely speaking. The forest remained eerily quiet. Eventually, nature called. I needed to pee badly, having downed 3 beers before all this started. I gotta go outside, I announced reluctantly. You're not going alone, Raymond said immediately. I'll come too, Trevor added, trying to sound brave. So the 3 of us prepared to venture out. Raymond checked his flashlight, and I grabbed my hunting knife. Fat lot of good that would do against whatever was out there. But it made me feel slightly better. We stepped outside cautiously. The fire had died down to embers, casting just enough light to see the immediate area around the campsite. The forest was still unnaturally quiet. I walked about 15 feet from the camper, just to the edge of the firelight, and started to relieve myself. That's when the sounds started again. A low, rumbling growl, followed by what sounded like wood knocking against wood somewhere in the darkness. Hurry up, Dad, Trevor hissed from behind me. I finished as quickly as I could, zipping up my pants with shaking hands. When I turned around, I saw Raymond sweeping his flashlight across the tree line again, his movements more frantic than before. That's when I noticed Trevor and Raymond were both gesturing frantically towards something at the edge of the trees, about 60 yards away. Dad, come here, Trevor whispered urgently, his eyes never leaving whatever he was seeing. I hesitated. Part of me, a very large part, wanted to run back into the camper and pretend none of this was happening. Jackson, you need to see this, Raymond insisted, his voice strained. Reluctantly, I moved to stand beside them. Raymond pointed with his free hand. There, by that big oak. Do you see it? At first, I couldn't make out anything unusual, just trees and shadows. Then Raymond adjusted his light slightly, and I saw it. It was partially hidden behind a massive oak tree, with its right arm wrapped around the trunk. The creature was massive, easily 7 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was covered in thick, dark hair, but I could clearly see the skin around its face, a dark grayish-brown color that looked leathery even from this distance. The face, God, the face is what I can't forget. It wasn't human, but it wasn't animal either. The brow ridge was pronounced, the nose flat and wide, but the eyes, those eyes were intelligent. They were watching us, studying us. I could feel its gaze like a physical weight. The creature remained almost completely motionless, only its chest moving slightly with each breath. It was using the tree as cover, clearly aware that it provided camouflage. That level of calculated behavior is what frightened me most. Holy shit, I breathed, unable to form any other words. Trevor was trembling beside me. Raymond's hand holding the flashlight had gone white-knuckled. We stood frozen in mutual terror for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Then, without any communication between us, we all simultaneously started backing toward the camper. The creature didn't move. It just watched us retreat, those eyes following our every step. Once inside, we locked the door and collapsed onto the seats. None of us slept that night. We sat in silence for hours, jumping at every sound outside. The whoops and growls continued sporadically throughout the night, sometimes close, sometimes farther away. At one point, something heavy walked around the perimeter of our campsite, its footsteps unmistakable on the leaf litter. When dawn finally broke, we were exhausted and shaken. The woods had returned to normal, birds singing, squirrels chattering. It was as if the previous night had been some collective nightmare. We were packing up to leave when we noticed another group setting up camp about a quarter-mile away. As we approached them to warn them about what happened, I noticed their vehicle had a sticker that read, Oklahoma Bigfoot Research Team. I almost laughed at the coincidence. We told them what we'd experienced, expecting skepticism. Instead, they listened intently, asking detailed questions about the sounds, the behavior, and especially where we had seen it. One of the researchers, a guy named Mike, came back to our camp with us. He examined the area around the oak tree where we'd seen the creature, finding several broken branches high up that shouldn't have been accessible to normal wildlife. He measured the tree circumference and did some calculations, then told us based on where the creature's arm had been positioned, it was approximately 7.5 feet tall. We packed up and left that day. I haven't been back to Witta National Forest since, and I have no plans to return. Uncle Raymond passed away last winter, but Trevor and I still talk about what happened sometimes, usually late at night after a few drinks. I grew up hearing stories about these creatures. My grandfather swore he saw one when he was a young man hunting in the mountains. I always thought they were just tall tales, meant to scare kids or explain strange noises in the woods. I don't think that anymore. What we saw that night was real. It was intelligent, and it was watching us just as intently as we were watching it. I still go hunting, but I never stay in the woods after dark anymore. And whenever I hear those stories around campfires, I stay quiet, because I know something most people don't. Sometimes the monsters from our folklore aren't just stories. Sometimes they're standing just beyond the firelight, watching and waiting. Story 12. I've never shared this experience with anyone outside my immediate family and closest friends. After all these years, I still get goosebumps when I think about it, but I need to get this off my chest. This happened back in the summer of 1992. My husband Dave, our 7-year-old son Michael, and I decided to spend a weekend camping along Blue River near English, Indiana. We were lucky enough to know Mrs. Carpenter, an elderly woman who owned some beautiful private land there. She'd always been sweet to us and had an open invitation for us to camp on her property whenever we wanted. Our friend Tom joined us that weekend. He and Dave had been buddies since high school, and Tom was practically family at this point. Michael adored him, probably because Tom was this giant 6'2" guy who always gave Michael piggyback rides and taught him how to skip rocks. We arrived Friday afternoon around 4. It was one of those perfect summer days, not too hot, clear blue skies, just beautiful. Mrs. Carpenter greeted us at her farmhouse, gave us some fresh baked cookies, and told us to make ourselves at home down by the river. She seemed a little off, though. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but something about her demeanor was different from her usual warm, welcoming self. We drove down the dirt road to our usual spot, about half a mile from her house. It was this gorgeous clearing about 50 yards from the river, surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides. We'd been coming here for years, and it always felt like our own little paradise. We set up our 2 tents, one for Dave and me, the other for Michael and Tom. Michael was so excited he could barely contain himself, running around helping to unpack while chattering non-stop about fishing and exploring. Everything felt so normal, so safe. Around 6 in the evening, Dave and Tom decided to gather firewood while I started unpacking our cooler to prep dinner. Michael was playing with his action figures at the entrance to our campsite, where the small clearing met the trail leading back to Mrs. Carpenter's house. He was maybe 30 feet away from me, still well within my sight, but just at the edge of the tree line. I was digging through our supplies when suddenly I heard Michael's footsteps running toward me. Not the normal excited running of a kid having fun. This was different. Before I even looked up, I could hear his breathing was off. When I saw his face, my stomach dropped. He was pale, eyes wide with panic, and he literally crashed into me, wrapping his arms around my legs so tight it almost hurt. "Michael, what's wrong?" I asked, immediately kneeling down to his level. He was trembling and could barely get the words out. "Mom, there's a big black man watching me from the trail," he whispered, his voice shaking. I immediately thought someone had wandered onto the private property. "What do you mean, honey? Who did you see?" What he said next made my blood run cold. He wasn't talking about a person at all. "He's bigger than Tom, Mom. Way bigger. And he's covered in black hair, all over. He was just standing there watching me." I tried to stay calm for Michael's sake, but my heart was pounding. "Where exactly did you see him, sweetie?" Michael pointed toward the trail. "Right there where the path gets dark. He was just standing still. He didn't say anything, he just watched me." I scanned the tree line but didn't see anything moving. I shouted for Dave and Tom, who thankfully weren't far. They came running back to the campsite within seconds, arms full of firewood. "What's wrong?" Dave asked, immediately dropping the wood when he saw Michael's state. I explained what Michael had told me. Dave and Tom exchanged looks, and I could tell they were trying to decide whether to take it seriously or chalk it up to a child's imagination. "I'll go check it out," Tom said, grabbing a large stick from the firewood pile. "I'm coming with you," Dave added, picking up our flashlight even though it was still daylight. They headed toward the trail while I stayed with Michael, who refused to let go of me. I tried to distract him, suggesting we start setting up for dinner, but he wouldn't budge. His eyes remained fixed on the spot where Dave and Tom had disappeared into the trees. They returned about 15 minutes later, looking puzzled. "We didn't see anyone," Dave said quietly, pulling me aside while Tom tried to cheer up Michael. "But there was this smell." "What kind of smell?" I asked. "Like something dead, rotting, but not quite like an animal carcass." "It was just in one spot on the trail, really strong, then nothing," Tom nodded. "Never smelled anything quite like it. Almost made me gag." I looked at Michael, who was still visibly shaken. I've known my son his whole life. He wasn't the type to make up stories for attention, and he definitely wasn't the type to get scared easily. Something had terrified him. "Should we leave?" I whispered to Dave. He hesitated. "Let's give it a little time. It's getting late to pack everything up. If anything else happens, we'll go immediately." I wasn't entirely comfortable with that decision, but I agreed. We tried to return to normal, building a fire and cooking hot dogs for dinner. Michael stayed glued to my side the entire time. He barely touched his food, which was completely out of character for him. As the evening progressed, Michael seemed to relax a little, especially after Tom suggested roasting marshmallows. We were trying so hard to make things feel normal again, but there was this undeniable tension hanging over us. Around 9, Tom remembered there was supposed to be a meteor shower that night. He suggested we walk to the open pasture about 100 yards away from our campsite to get a better view of the sky. I was hesitant to leave our campfire, but Dave thought it might help take Michael's mind off what happened earlier. We grabbed blankets and flashlights and made our way to the pasture. It was a beautiful, clear night, perfect for stargazing. We spread out our blankets and lay down, pointing out constellations to Michael as we waited for the meteor shower to begin. We'd been there maybe 20 minutes when we heard it. The pasture bordered another section of dense woods, old-growth forest with massive trees. At first, it was just the sound of branches snapping. Not unusual in the woods at night. Raccoons, deer, and other animals are active after dark. But these weren't small twigs breaking. These were loud, substantial cracks, the kind made by branches as thick as your wrist. "Probably just a deer," Dave said, though I could tell by his voice he didn't believe it. Then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, two-legged, not the sound of a four-legged animal moving through the brush. This was the unmistakable rhythm of something walking upright. Crack, step, crack, step. It was moving parallel to the edge of the pasture, just inside the tree line where we couldn't see it. Whatever it was big, big enough to break substantial branches as it moved, and it wasn't trying to be quiet. We all sat up. Michael scrambled into my lap, burying his face against my chest. Tom stood up, shining his flashlight toward the woods. "Hello?" he called out. "Anyone there?" No response, just more breaking branches, then a sound I can only describe as a deep, rumbling breath, like someone exhaling heavily, but deeper, more guttural than any human could make. "We need to go," Dave whispered, helping me up while I clutched Michael. We gathered our blankets as quickly and quietly as possible. The sounds continued, moving in the same direction we were heading, back toward our campsite. It was as if whatever was in there was pacing us, staying just out of sight. We walked faster, almost jogging by the time we reached our campfire. The sound stopped once we were back at the clearing. Tom immediately added more wood to the fire, building it up until it was blazing. None of us said anything about leaving. Somehow the fire made us feel safer, and the idea of packing up in the dark seemed more terrifying than staying put. Michael wouldn't sleep in the separate tent with Tom anymore, so we all crammed into our tent. Nobody slept much. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had us on edge. At one point, around 2 in the morning, we heard what sounded like heavy footsteps circling our campsite, just beyond the firelight's reach. Dave and Tom took turns keeping the fire going all night. When morning finally came, we were exhausted but relieved. In the daylight, everything seemed less threatening. Dave and Tom decided to check the woods where we'd heard the noises the night before. I wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but they insisted on investigating first. I stayed with Michael, who still wouldn't let me out of his sight. They returned 30 minutes later, looking disturbed. They'd found a path of destruction through the woods, freshly broken branches and small trees bent aside as if something large had forced its way through. Whatever it was had created its own trail, not following any existing path. Could have been a bear, Tom suggested, but his tone made it clear he didn't believe that. Bears don't walk exclusively on 2 legs for that distance, Dave responded quietly, making sure Michael couldn't hear. We packed up quickly after that. As we were loading the car, Mrs. Carpenter came down to check on us. I noticed immediately that she had a shotgun with her, something I'd never seen her carry before in all our visits. "Leaving so soon?" she asked, trying to sound casual but clearly concerned. Dave mentioned we'd heard some strange noises in the night and thought it best to head home. I watched her face carefully as he spoke, and I saw something flash across her expression. Not surprise, but confirmation. "Probably for the best," she said simply. "The woods can be unpredictable sometimes." As Dave and Tom finished loading our gear, I pulled Mrs. Carpenter aside and asked directly if she knew what might have been out there. She looked at me for a long moment, then glanced at Michael, who was safely in the car. "Some things are better left alone," she said quietly. "That's why I carry this now." She patted the shotgun. "I don't go anywhere on the property without it these days." That was all she would say, but it was enough. Whatever had terrified my son, whatever had moved through those woods breaking branches like twigs, Mrs. Carpenter knew about it, and it scared her enough to arm herself on her own property. We never camped at Blue River again. Michael had nightmares for months afterward. He would wake up crying, saying the hair man was watching him. Even now, 30 years later, he refuses to go camping or hiking. I've read stories since then about Bigfoot sightings in southern Indiana. I never believed in such things before that weekend, but when I think about what Michael described, the impossible strength it would take to break those branches, the smell, the deliberate 2-legged movement, and most telling of all, Mrs. Carpenter's shotgun, I can't explain it any other way. Something was watching us that night, something that didn't belong in those woods, something that, to this day, makes my skin crawl when I remember the sound of those footsteps pacing us through the dark. Story 13. I still can't sleep properly, and it's been almost 2 weeks since it happened. I keep all the lights on in my house from dusk till dawn now. My wife thinks I'm overreacting, but she didn't see what I saw. She didn't feel what I felt when I looked at that thing. This happened just last month, mid-October. I live in a pretty rural area outside Waynesboro. Our house sits on about 3 acres, backing up to woods that stretch for miles. We've got an old stable out back that we don't use anymore except for storage, and beyond that is just trees and more trees. That night, my wife Carol had gone into town for her book club. They usually wrap up around 9, but sometimes they get to talking and don't finish until 10 or later. I was just watching some football replay on TV, nothing special. It must have been around 8:30 when I first heard the noises. At first I thought it was just the wind. October gets pretty gusty around here, and we've got this big oak that sometimes scrapes against the side of the house. But then I heard something that sounded deliberate, a kind of shuffling, followed by a heavy thump, then another. It was coming from the back porch. My first thought was raccoons. We've had issues with them before getting into our trash, but this sounded bigger, much bigger. Then I heard a scraping sound, metal on metal, and I knew something was seriously wrong. I muted the TV and just listened. There it was again, a heavy footstep, then a weird grunting sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard around here. We've had break-ins in the area before. A couple houses down the road got hit last summer. Thieves taking advantage of how spread out the properties are. Knowing police response time out here is slow, I immediately thought someone was trying to rob us. I keep a pistol in the side table drawer. I've had it for years, barely ever use it except at the range a couple times a year. I pulled it out, checked that it was loaded, and started moving toward the back door. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The noises continued, shuffling, thumping, and now what sounded like tearing, like someone ripping open packaging. We keep a chest freezer on the back porch. It's one of those big white ones where we store meat and stuff we buy in bulk. The thought of someone breaking into it made me angry, and that helped push down the fear a bit. Our back door has one of those small windows in it, but I couldn't see much through it in the dark. There's a light switch just inside the door that turns on the porch light. I stood to the side of the door, gun ready, and flipped the switch. The minute the light came on, I heard a startled grunt and heavy, fast footsteps. I looked through the window and saw something moving away from the house, something big, really big. I pushed open the door and stepped onto the porch, gun raised. What I saw, I still can't fully process it. It wasn't a person, at least not like any person I've ever seen. This thing was huge, had to be 7, maybe 8 feet tall. It was dark, bulky, covered in what looked like hair or fur, and it was moving fast, heading toward the tree line. I shouted, "Hey!" like an idiot, as if this thing was just some kid I'd caught stealing apples. It stopped for a split second and half-turned. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I swear to God it stood upright, like a man, but not a man. I panicked and fired 2 shots. The sound was deafening in the quiet night. I don't think I hit it. The thing took off running again, faster than anything that size should be able to move. I stepped further onto the porch, trying to keep track of where it went. That's when I saw it again, standing near our old stable. It was just standing there, watching me. I fired again, 3 more shots. The thing bolted back into the woods. I heard branches breaking as it crashed through the underbrush, and then nothing. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the gun. I went back inside and locked the door, then grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, trying to calm down enough to think clearly. I kept asking myself if I'd really seen what I thought I saw. Finally, I worked up the courage to go back outside. I kept the gun in one hand, flashlight in the other, sweeping it across the yard. Nothing moved. The only sounds were crickets and my own breathing. I approached the freezer cautiously. What I saw made my stomach drop. The heavy-duty handle was bent, not just bent, but twisted like it was made of soft metal instead of solid steel. The lid had these weird marks on it, almost like someone had tried to pry it open with their fingers, and they'd succeeded. Packages of frozen chicken were scattered around the porch. Some were torn open, the meat gone. It looked like something had been eating them while they were still frozen solid. Who or what eats frozen raw chicken? I noticed something else then. There were these long strands of hair stuck to the freezer door and handle. They weren't like human hair exactly. Thicker, coarser, and when I shined my light on the ground I could see footprints. Not shoe prints. Actual footprints. They were huge, maybe 12 to 14 inches long and about 6 inches wide. They didn't look fully human either. The shape was off, with what looked like massive toes. I backed away, almost tripping over myself to get back inside. I called Carol right away, told her to come straight home. I didn't tell her exactly what happened, just said someone had broken into our freezer and that I'd fired some warning shots. She said she'd be home in 20 minutes and that she was calling the sheriff. Those 20 minutes were the longest of my life. I sat with my back against the wall, gun in my lap, staring at the back door. Every creak of the house, every rustle outside made me jump. I kept thinking about those footprints, about the way that thing had moved. It wasn't natural. When Carol finally pulled up, I nearly cried with relief. The sheriff arrived about 10 minutes later with 2 deputies. By then, I'd calmed down enough to tell them what happened, though I left out the part about how tall the person was or how inhuman it seemed. I just said I'd seen a large figure breaking into our freezer, that I'd fired some warning shots and they'd run off. The sheriff, Jim Colton, I've known him for years, looked skeptical at first. But when I showed him the freezer, the bent handle, the scattered packages, his expression changed. One of the deputies found more of the chickens scattered near a gully about 50 yards from the house, along with strange markings in the soft ground. Jim called in more people. Soon we had about 8 guys out there with flashlights, combing the property and the edge of the woods. They found more prints, same size, leading deep into the forest. Jim collected some of the hair samples from the freezer and our screen door, which I hadn't even noticed had been damaged. By morning, word had spread, and half the county seemed to know about it. A few of the local hunters volunteered to track whatever it was, but the trail went cold about a mile into the woods, near a creek. About a week later, Jim called to tell me the lab results on the hair. He sounded uncomfortable, said the report was inconclusive. The hairs appeared human, possibly light brown to white blonde in color, but there were anomalies they couldn't explain. Jim suggested it might have been some homeless guy with long hair, maybe on drugs, which would explain the unusual strength. But that doesn't explain how he bent a solid steel handle with his bare hands, or how he ate frozen meat, or those footprints, or how tall he was, or how fast he moved. Since then, I've heard stories from others around Waynesboro. The Petersons, who live about 3 miles from us, said they saw a tall figure walking through the trees at dusk last week. The Mitchell boy claims he heard weird crying sounds coming from the woods while he was out hunting, and a bunch of people have mentioned their dogs acting strange, refusing to go outside at night. I installed security lights all around our property the day after it happened. I bought a bigger gun too. Carol thinks I'm being paranoid, says it was probably just some desperate homeless person, but she didn't see what I saw. I know what a person looks like, even in the dark. What was in our yard that night wasn't a person, and I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, watching our house, waiting. Sometimes at night, I think I hear those heavy footsteps again, circling the property, testing the boundaries. Whatever it was hungry enough to break into our freezer once. What happens when it gets hungry again? Story 14. I haven't spoken much about what happened to me and my family near Pope, Mississippi, back in 2013 and 2014. To be honest, I've tried to forget it, but it's been eating at me lately, so I figured I'd finally put it all down somewhere. Maybe someone else has seen the same thing. It started in April 2013. My dad and I are big turkey hunters, and we'd head out before dawn most spring mornings to listen for gobbles. This particular morning, we hiked up this ridge that overlooks a dense pine thicket. It's a good spot because you can hear everything in the valley below. We got up there around 5:30 in the morning while it was still dark and settled in quietly. The sun was just starting to come up, casting this weird gray light through the trees. Everything was dead quiet. You know that special kind of silence that happens right before dawn? We were sitting there maybe 20 minutes, not saying a word, just listening for turkeys, when this sound echoed through the trees below us. I can't really describe it properly. It wasn't a turkey, wasn't a deer, definitely wasn't a coyote or dog. It was this deep, guttural noise that seemed to roll up from the bottom of the valley, almost like a moan, but way deeper than any human could make. It lasted maybe 3 or 4 seconds before stopping. My dad and I just looked at each other. I remember the hairs on my arms standing straight up. About 5 minutes later, it happened again, Same sound, same direction, but louder this time. It was like whatever made it had moved closer to us. Dad whispered, "What the hell was that?" And I just shook my head. Neither of us had heard anything like it before, and we've spent our whole lives in these woods. After that second sound, everything just felt wrong. The birds that had started chirping went silent. There was this heavy feeling in the air, like right before a bad storm. We waited maybe another half hour, but we didn't hear any turkeys or that sound again. Finally, Dad just nodded toward the trail, and we packed up and left. The weird thing is, we barely talked about it on the way home. It's like we both didn't want to acknowledge what we'd heard. Dad just said, probably some kind of weird echo, and changed the subject. But I could tell it bothered him too. I tried to forget about it, and honestly I mostly did, until that July. I was driving with 3 of my buddies, Josh, Tyler and Mike, on that same back road that runs near those pine woods. It was around 11 at night, and we were just cruising around like you do in small towns when you're bored. It was crazy foggy that night, the kind where your headlights just reflect back at you. We had the windows down, music playing, but not too loud. We were going maybe 30 miles per hour because of the visibility. Tyler suddenly says, "What's that?" pointing toward the bank on the right side of the road. I slowed down, and we all leaned forward to look. There were 2 red eyes reflecting in my headlights from up on the bank. At first, I thought it was a deer, but the eyes were too high up and too far apart. Before anyone could say anything else, this figure stepped onto the road about 100 yards ahead of us. My headlights caught it, but just barely through the fog. It was tall, ridiculously tall, maybe 8 feet, standing on 2 legs. It wasn't a bear or anything I recognized. It moved across the road in 3 or 4 strides, walking upright like a person, but not like a person at all. The way it moved was just wrong somehow, too fluid, too quick for something that size. It never looked at us, just crossed and disappeared into the trees on the other side. The whole thing took maybe 5 seconds. "What the fuck was that?" Mike almost screamed from the back seat. Nobody answered. I hit the gas and we got out of there fast. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. Later, when we'd calmed down enough to talk about it, we tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was a guy in a costume, but who would be out there in the middle of nowhere at that time of night? A bear standing on its hind legs. But it didn't move like a bear at all. Bears don't walk upright that smoothly for that distance. The way it crossed the road was too deliberate, too human. But it definitely wasn't human. I remembered that sound from April then, and wondered if there was a connection. I mentioned it to the guys, but they just got more freaked out, so I dropped it. I didn't go back to that road for a long time after that. But the following August 2014, my 2 sisters, Emma and Kayla, were visiting from college, and they wanted to go deer spotting before dark. It's something we used to do as kids, just drive the back roads around sunset and count how many deer we could see in the fields. I didn't want to go near that road, but it's one of the best for seeing deer, and they kept insisting. Plus, my buddy Jason was with us, and I figured it would be fine in daylight with more people. So we went. It was about 7 in the evening, still plenty of light left. We'd seen a few deer already and were having a good time. I was driving slowly, maybe 15 miles per hour, with Emma in the passenger seat and Kayla and Jason in the back. We were on that same stretch of road, but I hadn't told any of them what happened there the year before. Suddenly, Emma screamed, like a full-on horror movie scream. It scared the shit out of me and I slammed on the brakes. "What? What is it?" I asked, turning to look at her. She was white as a sheet, staring out her window. "There's someone back there," she whispered. "Something. Standing in the trees." I turned around in my seat and looked out the back window. For just a second, literally just a split second, I saw something large about 30 yards behind us on the edge of the tree line. It was tall, dark, and moved quickly into the trees as soon as I spotted it. "Did you guys see that?" I asked, my voice shaking. Kayla was crying in the back seat. It was just standing there watching us. Then it took one step and just disappeared. It was so fast. Jason hadn't seen anything. He'd been looking at his phone, but both my sisters were completely freaked out. I started driving again, faster this time, trying to get away from there. When we got home and they'd calmed down enough to talk, I asked them to describe what they saw. Emma said it was tall, way taller than a person, with long arms. Kayla said it was covered in dark hair or fur, and it stood perfectly still until it moved. The way they described it matched exactly what my friends and I had seen crossing the road the year before. That's when I told them about both previous incidents, the sounds Dad and I heard, and the thing crossing the road. We sat there in stunned silence for a while, trying to make sense of it all. I've done research since then, looked up local legends and stories. There are old tales about wild men in the Mississippi woods, but nothing specific to our area. I've thought about going to the local police, but what would I even say? Hey, there's an 8-foot-tall creature living in the woods that makes weird noises. They'd think I was crazy or on drugs. The thing that bothers me most is that all 3 incidents happened in basically the same area. Whatever this thing is, it seems to stay around those woods, and each time we encountered it, it was different. First just hearing it, then seeing it cross the road at night, then seeing it watching us during the day. It's like it was getting more, I don't know, bold, curious. I haven't been back to that road since that day with my sisters. My dad still hunts in those woods sometimes, but never alone, and never on that ridge again. He won't admit it, but I think what we heard that morning scared him as much as it scared me. I still live around here, but I take the long way around now, even though it adds 20 minutes to my drive. Sometimes at night I think I hear that sound again, that deep guttural moan, but it's probably just my imagination playing tricks on me. At least that's what I tell myself. I don't know what we encountered out there. Part of me doesn't want to know. But I can't shake the feeling that it knows us now, that it recognized my car the second time, that it was waiting for us that third time. Whatever it is, it's still out there in those pine woods, and sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night and the wind is blowing through the trees outside my window, I swear I can hear it moving around out there, making that sound again, like it's calling to something or someone. Story 15. I'm finally writing this down after all these years. I've only told a handful of people, mostly former co-workers I trusted. What happened that day in September of 2003 still makes my hands shake when I think about it too much. I was working for the U.S. Forest Service in the Hayfork Ranger District of Shasta Trinity National Forest. Before that, I'd been a firefighter for several years, so I wasn't some greenhorn who jumped at every snapped twig. I'd transferred to silviculture work, basically monitoring forest regrowth and health, and was checking tree survival plots in a clear cut on Soldier Ridge that day. The ridge runs between Rattlesnake Creek and the North Fork of the Trinity River. I knew that area like the back of my hand. That morning started normal enough. I met with a tree thinning contractor to discuss some ongoing work, and around 11:30, I drove up to the northernmost cut to assess tree survival rates. The Forest Service requires these assessments to monitor reforestation success after logging operations. It was routine work I'd done hundreds of times before. Before starting my survey, I decided to eat lunch in a small, uncut patch of timber at the edge of the clear cut. Honestly, I was hoping to catch a glimpse of this mountain lion that had been spotted in the area several times. I'd seen its tracks before, and as an outdoorsman, I always enjoyed wildlife encounters. Well, most of them anyway. The September day was warm, but not hot, probably in the 70s. There was this stillness in the air that I remember distinctly. No wind, few birds. It was one of those quiet forest days that sometimes feels almost too quiet, but I didn't think much of it then. After finishing my sandwich, I packed up my gear and stepped out from the shade into the open, clear cut. The sun felt good after sitting in the shadows. I was about to start my plot measurements when I heard loud crashes coming from the brush at the far end of the clear cut. At first, I thought it might be the mountain lion I was hoping to see, or maybe a bear. Whatever it was making a lot of noise breaking through the underbrush. Then everything changed. Something, and I hesitate to even call it a something because it was so clearly a someone, stepped out of the brush line at the opposite end of the clear cut. It was walking upright, not hunched over like a bear occasionally does, but fully upright like a person. My first thought, weirdly enough, was that another Forest Service worker had come to the same area, but I knew that couldn't be right. No other assessments were scheduled, and my truck was the only vehicle I'd seen on the access road. This figure crossed a short stretch inside the brush belt, and then it stopped next to a young fir tree that was leaning at about a 45-degree angle. It rested its forearms on the trunk of that tree, and then, this is the part that still raises the hair on my neck, it deliberately turned and looked directly at me. I froze. Every instinct in my body was screaming to run, but I couldn't move. We just stared at each other across that clear cut. The distance was maybe 150 yards, but I could see it clearly enough to know this wasn't a person in a suit or another forest worker. The creature was huge. I've worked with a lot of big guys in firefighting and forestry, but this thing dwarfed any human I've ever seen. It stood somewhere between 6.5 to 7 feet tall, and that's a conservative estimate. Its upper body was massively built, with shoulders that had to be at least twice as wide as its waist, which I'd guess was around 50 inches itself. What struck me most was the hair covering its body. Not fur exactly, but hair. Reddish-brown on the legs and a darker chocolate brown on the back and shoulders. The hair wasn't uniform though. Parts of its face were exposed, showing dark skin, and I could clearly see that its elbows had this black, cracked skin that looked like old boot leather. That detail has stuck with me for years. Those exposed elbows with that weathered, cracked skin. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably about a minute. Then it pushed off from the tree with its forearms. It took 2 slow, deliberate steps uphill, still watching me, and made this deep, rumbling sound from its chest. Not a growl exactly, but this low, powerful rumble that I felt more than heard, even at that distance. Then it ducked behind the brush line and let out a scream that I still hear in my nightmares sometimes. It started as this guttural roar that lifted into a high whistle at the end. I've heard cougar screams, bear roars, elk bugling. Nothing in nature sounds like what came out of that thing's throat. After that initial scream, all hell broke loose. It started breaking branches, not small twigs, but substantial limbs that made loud cracks when they snapped. Then it began throwing things, chunks of wood, rocks, debris. They weren't all aimed directly at me, but they were definitely thrown in my direction. It was circling through the brush around the edge of the clear cut, moving fast, making these deep hooting sounds that would turn into growls. I was still frozen in place until a stone about the size of a softball bounced and rolled to a stop about 10 feet from me. That snapped me out of it. I turned and walked as fast as I could back to my truck without breaking into a full run. Something told me running might trigger a chase response. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I got to my truck, jumped in, locked the doors, and sat there trying to process what I'd just seen. I kept thinking it would come crashing out of the forest and approach the vehicle, but it didn't. After about 20 minutes, the woods got quiet again. The creature had either moved on or gone silent. Here's the crazy part. I still had work to do. Those survival plots needed to be checked, and I knew I'd have to explain if I came back with incomplete data. So I forced myself to go back out there. I grabbed my plot pole and notebook with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and I did my job. I've never worked so fast in my life. Every few seconds I'd scan the tree line, expecting to see that figure watching me again. I finished my work in record time and got back to the truck. I didn't see the creature again, but the whole time I felt watched. There was this heaviness in the air, this sense that something intelligent was observing me from just beyond the tree line. When I got back to the ranger station, I didn't tell anyone. What was I supposed to say? That I'd seen Bigfoot? That would have been career suicide. Federal agencies don't look kindly on employees who claim to see cryptids while on the clock. So I filed my report on the tree survival rates and kept quiet. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying every detail in my head. The way it moved, fluid and deliberate, not clumsy like you'd expect from something so large. The proportions of its body that were just wrong for a human. Shoulders too wide, arms too long, that dark cracked skin on its elbows, the intelligence in its eyes when it stared at me. In the years since, I've read everything I could find about Bigfoot encounters. Some details match what others have reported. The rock throwing, the wood knocking, the screams. But I've never read an account that mentioned those elbows with the cracked, leathery skin. That detail feels unique to my encounter, and it's partly why I'm so certain of what I saw. I stayed with the Forest Service for several more years after that incident. I kept doing my job, kept going into the woods, but I never went back to that particular clear cut alone. A few times, I thought I heard similar vocalizations in other parts of the forest. That deep rumble followed by hooting, but never saw anything like that creature again. It wasn't until about 4 years later that I finally told another person, a co-worker, and I were having beers after work, and he mentioned a strange experience he'd had in the same general region. I found myself telling him everything. He didn't laugh or dismiss it, he just listened. Since then, I've told a few other trusted former colleagues, but that's it. I'm still an outdoorsman. I still love the woods. But that day changed how I perceive wilderness. There's knowing theoretically that you might not be at the top of the food chain, and then there's coming face to face with something that proves it. Something that watches you with intelligence, that can strategize, that can intimidate without necessarily attacking. What I saw that day was undeniably a Bigfoot, bigger than any man, smarter than any animal. Not some guy in a suit playing a prank, not a bear walking funny. This was a creature that doesn't exist according to science, and yet I saw it as clearly as I'm seeing this keyboard while I type. I still have no explanation for what happened. All I have are the memories. The massive frame leaning against that young fir tree, the dark eyes staring directly into mine, the sound of that scream lifting into a whistle, and those distinctive black cracked elbows that looked like old boot leather. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Most days, I'm not sure I'd believe someone else telling this same story. But it happened, and to this day, whenever I'm in dense forest and the woods go completely silent, my heart starts racing and my hands begin to shake, because now I know what that silence might mean and what might be watching from just beyond the tree line. Story 16. I've been living in this small valley in Clark County, Alabama my whole life. Our family property is nestled up against woods that stretch for miles. For years, we just lived our lives without thinking much about what might be out there. But everything changed in February of 2009. It was February 16th, a Monday night. I remember because I'd just gotten home from work and was still annoyed about some argument with my boss. Around 8 in the evening, I went out to make sure the chickens were locked up for the night. We'd lost a few to coyotes the month before, so I'd gotten religious about securing the coop. The yard was dark, except for the pole light we share with my brother's place about 100 yards away. His house sits at the edge of our clearing, closer to the tree line. I was just latching the coop door when I felt it. That sensation of being watched that makes the hair on your neck stand up. I turned around slowly, and that's when I saw it. About 30 feet away, standing perfectly still next to my wife's garden, was this thing. At first, my brain tried to make it a person, maybe a hunter who'd wandered onto our property. But no, this was something else entirely. I'm 6'2", and this thing towered over me by at least a foot, maybe more. It had a massive frame, not fat but broad, built like a linebacker but bigger everywhere. The whole body was covered in this reddish-brown hair, shaggy but not matted. The light from the pole was hitting it just enough that I could make out the color and see how the hair moved slightly in the breeze. What struck me most was how it just stood there watching me, not running, not approaching, just observing, like it was assessing me the same way I was assessing it. The proportions were human-like but exaggerated. Longer arms, broader shoulders, a head that seemed to sit directly on those shoulders without much of a neck. I don't know how long we stood there staring at each other. Probably just seconds, but it felt like forever. Then it simply turned and walked toward the tree line. No rush, no panic. It moved smoothly, silently, with purpose. That's when I realized something else that chilled me. Our 3 dogs hadn't made a sound. These are dogs that bark if a leaf blows across the yard, and there was a 7-foot creature walking through our property, and they were dead silent. Only after it disappeared into the trees did the dogs start going crazy, barking and running to the edge of the yard. But they wouldn't go into the woods. They just stood at the tree line, barking like mad. I ran back to the house, almost tripping over my own feet. My wife could tell something was wrong the second I came through the door. I was shaking, couldn't even get the words out at first. When I finally told her, I could see she wanted to think I was crazy or joking, but she knows me better than that. She's never seen me that scared. Just 2 nights later, on the 18th, my brother called me around 9:30. His voice was tight, controlled in that way people sound when they're trying not to panic. He asked if I'd been outside his house in the last few minutes. When I said no, he told me he'd been washing dishes and looked out his kitchen window to see a large shape standing at the edge of his porch. He thought it was me at first, but something felt off about the proportions. Before he could get a better look, the pole light between our houses suddenly went out, plunging everything into darkness. That's when he remembered something he'd been trying to forget for years. Back in 2005, he'd been walking from his house to mine around dusk when he heard what sounded like a woman screaming from deep in the woods. Not just any scream, the kind that makes your blood freeze. He ran the rest of the way to my house and didn't mention it afterward because it scared him so badly. After these 2 incidents, we started talking more openly about other strange things that had happened over the years. Things we dismissed or rationalized away, the deep rhythmic whooping sounds we sometimes hear echoing through the trees at night. Not like an owl or any animal we know, more like someone trying to communicate. My oldest dog, a German Shepherd mix, disappeared for 2 days 4 years ago. When he came back, he was torn up badly. The vet said it looked like he'd fought something big, but the claw marks didn't match any known predator in our area. My brother's dog was found dead in his pen 3 years ago. The chain-link pen was partially collapsed, like something had pushed against it with tremendous force. The dog hadn't been eaten, just killed. Last summer, something hit the side of my house so hard it rattled the windows. When I went to check, there was nothing there, but I found a dent in the siding about 7 feet up. My brother has heard heavy footsteps crossing his metal roof multiple times, always late at night during the fall and winter months. The constant feeling of being watched when we're outside after dark. We used to joke about it, but it's not funny anymore. What really gets me is that none of this seemed connected until now. It's like my brain refused to put the pieces together, but after seeing that thing in my yard, I can't ignore it anymore. I'm convinced we have Bigfoot creatures living in the woods around our hollow. I know how that sounds. If someone had told me this story a month ago, I'd have thought they were nuts or drinking too much. But I know what I saw. That thing was no bear. Bears don't stand upright that long, and they move differently. It wasn't a man in a suit. The proportions were all wrong, and the way it moved was too natural, too fluid. The hair covering it wasn't like fur exactly. More like long human hair, but all over its body. What really sticks with me is the intelligence I sensed. The way it held my gaze, the way it seemed to understand that it had been spotted and made a deliberate choice to leave. The fact that it somehow kept our dogs quiet while it was present, but they went crazy after it left. That suggests something that knows how to stay hidden, something smart enough to avoid detection most of the time. After these incidents, I started researching. Turns out Clark County has a history of Bigfoot sightings going back decades. People have reported similar creatures all through this part of Alabama. The descriptions match what I saw. Tall, reddish-brown hair, broad build, moving silently through the woods. I installed more lights around both our properties. My brother got security cameras, though they haven't caught anything yet. We keep the dogs inside at night now. My wife thinks I'm overreacting, but she didn't see what I saw. She didn't feel that cold intelligence assessing her from across the yard. Last week, I found large footprints at the edge of our property. They were partly obscured by leaves, but definitely not human, at least 17 inches long and incredibly wide. I tried to take pictures, but they didn't come out clear enough to show anyone. The strangest part is how normal everything seems in daylight. The woods are just woods, peaceful, ordinary, but as soon as the sun sets, that feeling comes back, the sense that something is out there, watching, waiting. I find myself avoiding windows at night now. I don't go outside after dark unless I absolutely have to. My brother and I have talked about selling our properties and moving, but this land has been in our family for generations. Besides, where would we go if these things have been here all along, coexisting with us without major incidents? Maybe they're not looking to harm us. Maybe they're just curious, territorial, or protecting their own families. Still, I can't shake the memory of that creature standing in my yard, perfectly still, watching me with what felt like intelligence behind its eyes. I can't forget how it moved, deliberate, powerful, but completely silent. No human could move that quietly through dry leaves and twigs. I've started keeping a journal of anything unusual we notice. Strange sounds at night, missing items from the yard, unexplained tracks. Part of me hopes I'll never see it again, but another part almost wants another encounter, something I could document, something that would prove I'm not losing my mind. Last night, I woke up around 3 in the morning to the sound of those whooping calls from the woods. They were closer than ever before, almost at the edge of the clearing. I lay there in bed, frozen, listening as they continued for almost 10 minutes before fading away. My wife slept through it all. Sometimes I wish I could sleep that deeply. I don't know what to do next. Going to the authorities seems pointless. What would I tell them? That I saw Bigfoot in my yard? They'd think I was crazy or attention-seeking. Most of my friends already look at me sideways when I try to talk about it, so I've mostly stopped mentioning it. For now, we're just living with it, this strange knowledge that something else inhabits these woods with us, something intelligent, powerful, and hidden. Something that's probably been here far longer than we have. All I know is that I'm more careful now. I watch the tree line. I listen for unusual sounds. I make sure the chickens are locked up tight every night, and I wonder what else it might do, if our silent standoff will continue, or if something will eventually change. I keep asking myself, if it wanted to hurt us, wouldn't it have done so by now? We've been vulnerable plenty of times over the years, or maybe we've just been lucky. Maybe we've never crossed whatever invisible boundaries it has established. All I can say for certain is that I saw something that shouldn't exist according to science, something that's apparently been living alongside us for years. And now that I've seen it, I can't unsee it. I can't go back to pretending the woods are empty. Story 17. It was early May of 2013. The weather had just started to turn nice in Indiana after a pretty rough winter, and a few of us decided to go for an evening drive to enjoy being outdoors without freezing our asses off. There were 4 of us, me, Lynn, my roommate Jess, and our friends Mike and Dan. We'd all been friends since college, and we'd go on these little adventures every now and then when we needed to escape real life for a bit. Mike had his Jeep Cherokee, which wasn't anything fancy, but it could handle the dirt roads, so we piled in around 6 in the evening. We weren't planning to stay out super late, just wanted to drive around, maybe walk a few trails before it got dark. The plan was to check out this game access area near Yellowwood Forest. It's not one of the main entrances that tourists use. It's more of a spot that locals know about where you can access some unofficial trails, I'd been to this exact same spot the previous fall with a different group of friends. We'd gone during the day and hiked around for a few hours. Everything was totally normal until we were leaving at dusk. I remember standing by the car, waiting for everyone to pack up their stuff, when I noticed something at the edge of the forest, maybe 50 yards away. Two red reflective eyes, just watching us. I assumed it was a deer or something, but it made me uneasy enough that I mentioned it to the others, and we left pretty quickly. I never really thought about it again until that night in May. So anyway, we parked at this little gravel pull-off area. There wasn't anyone else around, which wasn't surprising since it was a weekday evening and not exactly a popular spot. The trails aren't marked or anything, but they're clear enough to follow. We grabbed our water bottles and started walking. The forest was really beautiful that time of year. Everything was that bright spring green, with little wildflowers starting to pop up along the path. We spent about an hour just wandering around, taking pictures and catching up. Nothing weird happened during the hike itself. It was actually really peaceful. Birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, that kind of thing. By the time we headed back to the Jeep, it was around 7:30 or 8. The sun was getting low, but it wasn't completely dark yet. That weird twilight time where everything looks kind of blue and grey. We all climbed into the Jeep, but we weren't in a rush to leave. Mike turned the engine on, but we just sat there with the windows cracked, continuing our conversation and enjoying the cool evening air. That's when things started to feel off. It's hard to explain exactly what changed, but the atmosphere shifted. The forest had been noisy with birds and insects all day, but suddenly everything went completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing, just dead quiet. I remember looking around at my friends to see if they noticed it too, and they all had this same confused expression. "You guys feel that?" Dan asked from the passenger seat. He was staring out the windshield with this weird intensity. We all nodded. The air felt heavy, almost like right before a thunderstorm, but the sky was clear. My skin was tingling, like when you feel someone staring at you. "Maybe we should go," Jess whispered from beside me in the back seat. She wasn't normally the jumpy type, which made her obvious discomfort even more alarming. Mike put the Jeep in reverse, but before he could back up, Dan grabbed his arm. "Wait," he said, his voice tight. "Look." About 30 yards ahead of us, at the edge where the gravel area met the tree line, something was crouched down low to the ground. At first, in the dim light, I couldn't really make out what I was looking at. It just looked like a dark shape. But then it moved slightly, and I saw them. Two reflective red eyes, catching what little light was left and glowing like embers. My stomach dropped. "That's what I saw last fall," I whispered, my mouth suddenly dry. None of us moved. We were all just frozen, staring at this thing, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. It wasn't a deer, it wasn't a bear, it was too big, too deliberate in its movements. "What the fuck is that?" Mike's voice cracked as he whispered. The creature must have heard us, even through the partially closed windows, because those eyes shifted slightly, focusing directly on the Jeep. I've never felt more exposed than in that moment, like it could see right through the metal and glass to where we sat. "Turn around, now." Jess's voice was barely audible. Mike didn't need to be told twice. He put the Jeep in reverse and started to back up slowly, intending to turn around in the small clearing. The headlights swept across the trees as he maneuvered, and that's when it stood up. Holy shit, the thing was enormous. It had been crouched down before, but as it rose to its full height, I realized we were looking at something at least 7 or 8 feet tall. Maybe taller. It was directly in the headlights now, and for the first time I could see it clearly. What I saw in those few seconds is burned into my memory forever. It wasn't an animal, but it wasn't exactly a person either. Its face was almost human, but wrong. It had deep-set eyes under a heavy brow ridge, and its nose was wide and flat. The skin looked dark, almost black, with patchy hair covering parts of its body. Not fur, hair. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, maybe twice the width of a large man, and its arms hung down almost to its knees. But it was the eyes that got me. They weren't just reflecting light like an animal's eyes do at night. They were glowing, like there was some internal light source behind them, and they were intelligent. That's what scared me the most. There was clear, unmistakable intelligence in those eyes as they locked onto mine through the windshield. For what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds, we stared at each other. Nobody in the Jeep made a sound. I don't think any of us were even breathing. The creature didn't move either, just stood there in the headlights, assessing us. Then, without warning, it took a step toward us. That broke the spell. "Go, go, go!" Dan yelled, and Mike slammed his foot on the gas. The Jeep lurched backward, tires spitting gravel. He cranked the wheel hard, nearly sending us into a ditch as he struggled to turn us around. The headlights swung wildly across the trees, and for a second, we lost sight of the creature. "Where is it?" Jess was pressed against the door, her eyes wide with panic. "Do you see it?" We were all whipping our heads around, trying to locate it through the windows, but it had vanished. Then Mike completed the turn, and the headlights illuminated the path back to the main road. It was empty. "Just drive," I said, my voice shaking so badly I could barely get the words out. "Please just drive." Mike didn't need to be told twice. He floored it, and we tore down that dirt path faster than was safe, branches scraping against the sides of the Jeep. Every bump and jolt had us gasping, convinced that at any moment that thing would appear in front of us, or worse, reach through a window. When we finally hit pavement, we all let out this collective breath. Mike didn't slow down, though. He drove about 20 miles over the speed limit until we were well away from Yellowwood Forest and back in familiar territory. We rode in silence for a long time, all of us processing what we'd seen. Finally, when we were nearly back to town, Dan spoke up. "What the hell was that?" His voice was hollow, drained. None of us had an answer. What could we say? We'd all seen it, but it didn't make any sense. "Bigfoot?" Mike suggested, but his nervous laugh fell flat. This wasn't like any Bigfoot description I'd ever heard. This was something different. "Did you see its face?" Jess whispered. "It looked almost human." "But way too big," I added. "No human is that size." We pulled into my driveway around 9:30, but none of us made a move to get out of the car. It felt safer somehow to stay together, as if separating would make us vulnerable again. "We should report it," Dan said eventually. Mike snorted. "Report what? To who?" "Hey, officer, we saw a giant human-looking monster in the woods. Just thought you should know." He had a point. We knew how it would sound. We'd be laughed out of the station. Or worse, people would think we were drunk or high. So we made a pact that night. We'd keep it between ourselves. We'd try to make sense of it together. But none of us would ever go back to that spot again. And we haven't. It's been more than 10 years, and I still won't drive anywhere near Yellowwood Forest after dark. I've researched similar sightings in the area, trying to find some explanation for what we saw. There are stories, vague accounts of tall creatures in the woods, red eyes watching from the trees, but nothing quite matches our experience. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was just a bear standing on its hind legs, or maybe some kind of optical illusion caused by the failing light. But then I remember those eyes, intelligent, aware, studying us. And I know whatever we saw that night wasn't anything that's supposed to exist. The four of us don't hang out as much anymore. Life pulled us in different directions. But occasionally, when we do get together, there's always this moment where someone will give a certain look, and we all know what they're thinking about. We never discuss it fully, just little comments here and there. Remember that night? Still think about those eyes sometimes. That kind of thing. I still have nightmares about it. In them, I'm alone in the Jeep, and those red eyes are getting closer and closer to my window. I always wake up before I see its face again. Maybe that's my brain's way of protecting me. I don't know what we saw that night in the Indiana woods, I don't know if it was some undiscovered species or something else entirely. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and for those few terrifying seconds, it was looking right at us, deciding what to do. And sometimes on dark nights when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's still out there, watching and waiting at the edge of the trees. And I wonder if one day someone else will pull into that same clearing and not be lucky enough to drive away.